welcome to our channel. Today, we delve into the chilling realm of horror stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. So dim the lights, grab a cozy blanket, and get ready for a thrilling ride through tales that will haunt your dreams. Are you ready to face your fears? I've been a trucker for close to 15 years now. This happened to me in 2017. I was driving an overnight haul through the Mojave Desert in California, headed for a destination in Arizona. I think I was delivering appliances, but I don't really remember. It was pitch black darkness in every direction. The headlights on my semi were really dim at the time, and I'd been putting off getting them fixed forever. Usually, I couldn't tell the difference, but since there were basically no other cars on the road, it was much more obvious. I remember having to strain my eyes every few minutes to make out the road in the distance. That could have been a horror story in and of itself. I was debating pulling over for a couple of hours and waiting for sunrise, but I didn't want to waste my time. I desperately needed the money at the time, so I kept driving even though it wasn't fully safe. I figured since it was basically a straight line, it would be okay. I think it was about an hour before sunrise when I saw something approaching fast in the distance. Worried about hitting an animal, I slammed on the brakes. As my truck screeched to a stop, I realized what was in front of me, a car with its hazards on. The weird thing was that it was in the exact middle of the road, literally on the double yellow. What was even weirder was that the passenger door was wide open. My truck stopped maybe a foot before hitting it. Not to toot my own horn, but I'm a pretty fearless guy, and I know my way around a bar fight. Because of this, I wasn't really scared when I saw the car. I was more curious than anything. I thought maybe someone needed a jump or something, so I reversed the semi and pulled over. I thought about throwing some flares down but decided against it since I hadn't seen a single other car on the road besides this one. I got out of my truck and made my way over to the car. It was a warm, still night. I remember thinking how strange it was that there was almost no wind. It was also really quiet that night. The faint click of the hazards was the only sound in what felt like the entire desert. I got a little closer to the car. I vividly remember that it was a new-looking red Ford Fusion. I approached the car a little cautiously. Like I said, the passenger door was wide open. I walked around the car and stopped in my tracks. It was completely empty. I made sure of it too, checking the back seat and anywhere someone might be lying down. There was literally no one inside. All of a sudden, I was much less sure about the situation. I was expecting someone to need help of some sort, maybe even someone who took a nap in a really dumb spot. I certainly wasn't expecting this, though. The car was literally empty. I cast a few glances over my shoulder, feeling a lot more uneasy now. I kept whipping my head around, looking in every direction. I felt like someone was going to charge me or something. The problem was it was so dark that I couldn't see that far in front of me except for what was lit up by my truck's headlights. It was eerie. I waited a while longer, thinking about getting back in my truck and forgetting about this whole thing. Someone was out there somewhere. Against my better judgment, I decided to keep investigating. I looked inside the car, but everything seemed completely normal. The key was even in the ignition, although the engine was turned off. I got back out of the car and made my way over to the trunk. Might as well have a look, I figured. I went to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. I grabbed the key out of the ignition and unlocked the trunk. Still, though, the thing wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the inside somehow. I opened the back door and tried getting at the trunk through the back seat. To my surprise, it actually opened. There were 3 squished garbage bags back there, along with a rope that was tying the trunk closed. I remember glancing one more time over my shoulder before reaching for them. The coast was clear. I must have been within 5 inches from one of the bags when the loudest gunshot I've ever heard rang out into the night. I slammed my head on the roof of the car in shock. I didn't even think. I threw the keys on the front seat and got out of the car as fast as I could. As I was climbing into my semi, I heard a grungy voice yelling in the distance. He yelled, "Hey," a bunch of times, and his voice seemed to be quickly approaching. I scrambled into the semi and turned it on. I threw it in gear as fast as I could. I remember cursing a bunch of times as the engine initially stalled. And that's when I saw it. As my truck began pulling out, I saw a person standing at the trunk of the car. It was a short, husky guy with red hair. He was wearing overalls and shin-high boots. In his left hand, he was holding a small shovel. In his right, though, was an old-looking hunting rifle. We locked eyes for a few seconds as my truck began to drive past him. He didn't move. I remember him not looking crazy or anything. He had this worried look on his face. As I passed him, he dropped his shovel and started waving his hands. He yelled, "Wait," a few times, but I wasn't staying there another second. As I drove away, I watched in the rearview mirror as he ran after my truck for a few seconds before sprinting back to his car. It was clear he wanted me to stop, but there was absolutely no way I was going to do that. I stepped on it, pushing the semi much faster than I should have. I drove for like 5 minutes and started to think I was in the clear, but then I saw headlights fast approaching behind me. I remember feeling more scared than I've ever felt in my entire life. I called the police and told them what happened to the best of my ability. That's when the car was basically right on my tail. It started honking like crazy at me. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I just kept driving, praying to God he wouldn't try and ram me. After like 15 minutes of this, he cut in front of me and hit his brakes, forcing me to slow down. I was just about to crash into him when finally some flashing police lights appeared ahead. The Ford veered off to the right and sped into the desert, disappearing from sight. I pulled over and waited for the officer to show up. I frantically told him what had happened, but the useless cop decided to get a report from me rather than chase the guy down. I was so pissed about that. I told the guy like twice that he could probably catch up to him if he left now. The cop told me not to worry and that they'd do a thorough search as soon as backup arrived. He sent me on my way and said they'd call me if they ever had an update for me. They never did. None of my buddies have a story this crazy, and I've told it more times than I can count. I know what you're probably thinking. That guy was definitely burying bodies. That doesn't really explain why he had such a small shovel or why he tried to follow me. The bags in his trunk were also too small for that, although some of my buddies think he might have done some dismembering. For my own sanity, I like to think that he was burying some other kind of animal, maybe putting a diseased dog out of its misery or some dangerous snakes. I really have no idea. Either way, I've never been totally comfortable driving through deserts late at night after this experience. I'm sure you've seen some of the more modern videos online where truckers document their daily routines and provide tips for each other. Or maybe you haven't, but being as I'm on the younger side in this industry, every time I open TikTok or YouTube Shorts, that's all I see. I won't get into it, but I had to drop out of a pretty prestigious university for some personal reasons, and people always tell me I could have been more than a trucker. It's honestly not a bad gig though. I'd been making deliveries for north of 2 years. Obviously, the only strenuous part of the job is the long hours. You can never truly gauge how the isolation will affect you without experiencing it firsthand. My only advice would be to make peace with whatever demons might be lurking in your subconscious, because they'll definitely eat at your brain in the lonely hours. That's what happened to me anyway. This happened to me 3 months after getting employed by my first company. I was basically as new in this trade as one could get. I was driving from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana, a 12-hour drive. 12 hours driving might not seem that crazy, but factor in the fact that I had just completed an 8-hour trip, and that should put things into perspective. I wanted to get deliveries done as quickly as possible, so I opted to drive through the night. I did to Lafayette just before 3 a.m. Things were going smoothly. There were virtually no other cars on the road, so I was able to push the semi a little faster than normal. About halfway through the drive, I remember reaching down at the center console to chug a Red Bull, but there weren't any. Of course, I had forgotten to restock my truck after completing my previous delivery. After slapping my dashboard a few times, I groaned in frustration, knowing I'd have to stop somewhere. There was nothing I hated more than having to make stops during my drives. I might be unique in this, but I always get exponentially more tired when my vehicle is immobile, even if I'm only stopped for like 20 seconds. After glancing up at the navigation, I figured I had no choice, either fall asleep on the road or stop and get an energy drink. In my brain, those options were pretty much equivalent. Reluctantly, I pulled into the first service stop I saw. I had literally no clue where I was, probably somewhere in Ohio at this point. Too late, I realized this wasn't actually a service stop. It was what looked like an abandoned gas station and a repurposed convenience store. Not sure if there's any better way to describe it. Either way, it looked like there was another quick stop store not far up the road, so I figured I'd go there if anything. I parked the semi. I made my way over to the first convenience store. To be completely honest, I was expecting one of two things to happen. Either the place would be open, or the door would be locked. You can imagine my surprise then when the door swung open into a pitch-black store. I looked around, hoping maybe I'd get lucky and there would be a drink or snack left behind. Just before I was about to turn around, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I picked up on a faint glow emanating from the corner of the room. I made my way over to it, and the glow turned out to be coming from a back room of some sort. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the door slowly. To my pleasant surprise, there was a plugged-in refrigerator against the wall. Eagerly, I opened the door but found nothing. Literally nothing. The shelves had been removed, the whole appliance had been gutted. As I was shutting the door, I was 90% certain I heard a clatter from the main room, like something hitting the floor. I froze for a good 10 seconds. Had I imagined it? There was no way. Quietly, I walked back into the main room and looked around. Nothing. Part of me wanted to keep investigating, but I didn't have time for this. I walked out the entrance door and basically jogged to the other shop. It was open, thank God. I paid for my drink and made it back to my truck. Something about this whole stop felt wrong. I needed to get back on the road as soon as possible. I took one last glance at the abandoned store and noticed the door was now open. I was 100% positive I had shut it behind me. It wasn't my job to figure out what was going on here, so I started the engine and merged my semi back onto the highway. The caffeine started kicking in and snapped me out of my tired haze pretty quickly. My mind began to wander, and I started thinking about how bizarre that whole thing had actually been. I guess a squatter or an abandoned building wasn't the strangest thing in the world, but my brain couldn't explain that refrigerator, no matter what theory I thought of. I tried to forget about it and kept driving. It was then that I started noticing weird movements in the curtain behind me. Sweat started dripping down my forehead. I watched in the rearview mirror as the curtain seemed to billow and move, even though I didn't have the air on. I thought the worst: there was someone in my truck. I didn't have any weapons on me or anything, so I discreetly punched in the nearest police station on my phone. The drive there was the most tense and horrifying 20 minutes of my life. I kept imagining that person reaching out to grab me or trying to crash my truck. Finally, I approached the police station. I stopped the semi as close as I possibly could get and basically ran over to the police station. In seconds, my truck was surrounded by police, and after I opened the back, what I saw will stay with me for life. The police pulled out 3 homeless-looking people, 2 men and 1 woman. They were wearing rags and were wrapped in nasty-looking blankets. One of the men was armed with 2 switchblades. All 3 of them refused to talk but stared menacingly at me as they were getting cuffed. I have no idea what they wanted. I don't think I'll ever know. My name is Arthur. I've been a trucker for various companies for the better part of 15 years now. Things have become pretty routine at this point. Pick up the goods and materials, verify them for accuracy, and deliver them as instructed. We're not paid by the hour, so efficiency is the most important thing in this line of work. For someone like me who's been doing this forever, I like to think I can outwork all these young guns that are snapping these jobs up. This isn't always great, though. Usually, I push myself to the absolute limit when it comes to functioning on barely any sleep. 4 years ago, I was working for a warehouse based in North Dakota. For anyone who doesn't know, North Dakota is one of the flattest states, which makes trucking a little easier. This also meant that skipping out on a few hours of sleep could mean the difference between employment and getting the sack. It was a chilly Tuesday morning in May. The beginning of the week meant that more loads needed to be shipped, which meant more work for me. I wanted to knock it all out in one shot, so I traced my route into Montana accordingly, planning on not stopping even once to sleep. I hit the road a few hours after lunch, expecting to reach my destination very early the next morning. I pushed the semi as much as possible, doing maybe a couple over the speed limit. It was getting late, and I remember rubbing the crust from my eyelids as the clock ticked past midnight. I was having trouble keeping my eyes open, but I only had about an hour left in this drive, so I gritted my teeth and kept going. My buddy Tristan, who was also a trucker, introduced me to smelling salts when I first started out. If you don't know, smelling salts are basically some kind of crystals in a little bottle. One sniff and you're wide awake. You had to be careful, though. Too many back-to-back uses could be dangerous, or at least that's what Tristan told me. They burn your nose a little bit, but whenever I needed a boost, I'd reach for the smelling salts first. This was one of those times. I took a big whiff and shot my head back, my reflexes taking over. I felt the adrenaline course through my body and hoped the feeling would last the rest of the drive. A half hour shot by, and I was really struggling. I felt myself start to doze off, and the blare of my truck drifting into the shoulder jolted me awake. This was getting dangerous, I thought. I had to pull off. I was all alone on the highway, but there was nowhere to pull off. There were just woods on either side of me. I slowed the truck down, searching desperately for somewhere to pull over. At this low speed, my headlights pierced through the darkness, and I was able to see a lot more. As I looked around, I saw something that confused me. There was a purple dress lying in the middle of the road. What the hell, I thought, rubbing my eyes. Was I hallucinating? I blinked like 6 times just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. It was real. I approached the dress with my truck and stared at it as I rolled by. In hindsight, this should have been more of a red flag, but I think I was just too exhausted to process what was going on. About 200 or so yards away, I passed a pair of shoes. Now I was starting to freak out. What the hell was going on? I passed the shoes, praying to God there would be a place to pull off soon. My old man Finn was a super religious guy, so I clutched his old cross and hoped he would come through for me. A little further up the road, I saw a bunch more random clothing, some of which looked like little kids' clothing. This time, I stopped the truck. The panic started to set in. Something was very, very wrong. I sat in the driver's seat with the truck at a standstill. I was expecting something to happen, but it never did. So I did what my instincts told me to do. I stepped out of the truck and went to inspect the clothing. I still remember the feeling of the chilly morning air piercing my skin, which definitely helped my exhaustion. I approached the pile as cautiously as I could. It was indeed kids' clothing. It looked like there were both boy and girl pieces of clothing in the pile. I looked around into the woods, but I couldn't see much of anything in the darkness. I had my head on a swivel, worried that this was some kind of trap. I decided it was not my business to figure out what was going on, so I made my way back to my truck. Just then, I heard a crunch from the left. I whipped around, trying to see what was there. I stood there, waiting to hear another sound. After about 30 seconds, there was another crunch, but this time from the opposite side of the road. My survival instincts kicked in, and I sprinted towards the truck. I jumped into the front seat, but just before I slammed the door, I heard a child's scream ring out. I froze, my heart bursting out of my chest. I was caught at a crossroads. I wasn't going to fight some random people in pitch-black woods, but I couldn't just abandon some helpless kids either. Before I could make a decision, another almost identical child's scream rang out. Without thinking, I turned the truck on and pointed its nose toward the spot in the woods where I heard the noise. My headlights lit up about 30 yards into the woods. There were 3 or 4 people, one of whom was holding a massive speaker. They ducked behind a couple of trees as my truck lit them up, but I had exposed them for just enough time to make out what they were doing. They hid from the light before I could really make out any distinctive features, but I swear on my old man Finn's grave, they were holding up a speaker, trying to lure me into the woods with a fake kid screaming. I was just in shock. I just sat there staring at the trees those people had just hidden behind. I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I finished dialing, I heard a thump from the body of the truck. Someone had thrown something from the other direction. I was done. I turned back to face the road and slammed on the gas. As I sped off, I could make out a person on the other side of the road. He shouted something I couldn't understand before launching something at the truck that cracked the glass of my passenger side window. I drove the final hour in silence. I was too scared to process what had just happened, but there was no way in hell I was stopping to sleep in those woods. I completed my delivery and then knocked out. I must have slept for 10 hours straight. When I woke up, the first thing I did was call the police, who told me they'd investigate those woods and give me any updates. I then thought about About 7 years ago, on my way home from my parents' house, I experienced something truly terrifying. I was 22, young, naive, and well, dumb. I had just moved into my first apartment, becoming the first in my family to leave our sleepy old train town. I visited home every Sunday to see my family, do laundry, and enjoy Sunday dinner. I lived about 45 minutes up the highway, so I generally headed home by 6 p.m. On this particular night, there was a relentless summer thunderstorm that had been pouring down rain all day. Just as I was packing up to leave after dinner, my cousins dropped in, so I ended up sticking around for a few more hours to visit. I left my mom's around 10 p.m. in the pouring rain. This was the first time after moving out that I encountered something that truly scared me. I never told anyone about this, possibly out of pride. Everyone always gave me trouble about living alone as a single female in a new area. Anyway, here it goes. I left my parents' house around 10 p.m. in the pouring rain. I'm driving down the service road that leads out of town and eventually turns into the on-ramp to the highway. As you leave town, the service road turns into one lane right in front of a quarry train loading station. I'm not really clear on what that place is, but it always gave me the creeps. If you're unfortunate enough to pass through when a train is crossing the road to load, you'll be stuck there for a while. Once the road passes the tracks, it turns back into two lanes and goes up a steep hill. As I'm approaching the quarry, I can make out the orange lights on a red cab 18-wheeler sitting in the quarry parking lot. Mind you, it's pouring rain, visibility is low, so I can't make out the trucker until I'm pretty close to him. As soon as I can see it's a trucker, he pulls out into the road. I had to slam on my brakes to avoid hitting the trailer on the back of the truck. I skid around on the road until I regained control of the car. Now I'm stuck behind this dummy who just pulled out without paying attention. I keep my distance because I'm flustered. For the record, my headlights were on, so if he had been paying attention, he should have seen me. Honestly, with the heavy rain and low visibility, who knows? So, I'm behind this guy as we cross the tracks and begin to climb the steep hill. Despite it turning into two lanes on the hill, he's driving right up the middle of the two lanes. Figuring he didn't realize it was two lanes, I just putter along behind him, keeping my distance. As soon as he reaches the peak of the hill and the road levels out, he moves over to the right lane. Yes, finally. So, I move over and begin to pass him. As soon as I get past the front of the truck, he swerves behind me quite abruptly and begins flashing his high beams at me. Usually, when someone flashes their lights behind you in our area, it means turn on your lights, but mine were already on. I checked as soon as he started flashing at me. Weirded out, I put my blinker on and safely changed lanes to get out of his way. He follows my lane change and begins laying on his horn. The honking startled me, and I began to get a lot more flustered. What the hell did this guy want? I moved out of his way and my headlights were on. Why didn't I just speed up and zip away, you may be asking. Well, I grew up in this area. It had been raining heavily all day, and I knew that the service road floods a little in heavy rain, both on the shoulders and in random spots in the middle of the lanes. It's a small Midwestern town. Our roads are shitty. I had already skidded and nearly wrecked once, and I wasn't about to floor it on this bumpy, flooded service road and risk wrecking again. There is nothing between that quarry and the highway, just about 4 or 5 miles of wooded area. If I wrecked, it would have been just him and me. This went on for the next 4 or 5 miles to the highway. He began tailgating me in addition to the high beams and honking. Once the tailgating began, I was in tears. I didn't know what this guy wanted from me. I was just trying to stay out of his way and get home safely. That's all I wanted. I changed lanes 2 more times, making 3 total. He followed me from lane to lane. As we approached the highway, I floored it. He couldn't accelerate quickly enough to keep up, and I lost him finally. As soon as I realized I'd lost him and was safe on the highway, I just lost it. I was a hysterical wreck. There is only one exit after getting on the highway to stop in the small town the highway runs through. After that, it's all wooded for a good 30 minutes. Here's a more structured and coherent version of your text with appropriate pauses. I thought about getting off at that exit to calm down and pull myself together, but I just wanted to go home, so I sped right past it. I should have stopped. Once the city was no longer visible in my rearview mirror, I felt much calmer. I managed to scramble my cell out of my purse and put it in my lap just in case. The rain led up to a drizzle the further I went, but I was still pretty on edge. There weren't many other cars on the highway, and most of them were truckers. I'm cruising along in the center lane when the truck next to me in the passing lane begins blaring the horn and moves into my lane, forcing me over to the third lane. He continued moving over, nearly forcing me off the highway. I sped up and changed lanes right in front of him so that I'm back in the center lane. I slowed down until I was in line with the front cab. I double-clicked the home button on my phone, camera shortcut, and rolled down my window, starting to take pictures of the cabbie. I think the flashes made him realize what I was doing, and he began slowing down until he was behind me again. I got a lot of pictures. I sped up and lost sight of him behind me. I was satisfied I managed to get pictures, but I was so angry at this point. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway and waited for him. I just wanted to get behind him so I could get a picture of the license plate and report this. Sadly, he was on to me for sure. I noticed headlights behind me a long way back, but behind me nonetheless, on the shoulder of the highway. I waited, keeping an eye on the truckers passing me by, just to be sure I didn't miss him. I noticed a shadow pass through the headlights of the truck, which spooked me quite a bit. Did he get out of the cab? I didn't stick around to find out. I just took off and got home as quickly as possible. The pictures were a total failure. It was still drizzling. The flash combined with the drizzle just resulted in washing out the pictures. I could see the red cab, but no matter what filters I used, there was no making out exactly what the cab said. Red cab trucker, you're the reason I have a dash cam in my car. We were hitchhiking through Europe, my then boyfriend and I, and on our way back home, a truck driver picked us up. We had had a few weird encounters on our trip before, but we had been on the road for about a month, and nothing really scary happened until we met this guy. He was a young guy, about 25, quite regular, spoke English okay, and had been away from home for a long time. I was a bit younger, with my boyfriend being around his age. My boyfriend was tired, so he took a seat on the bed in the truck and wasn't really trying to hold a conversation. During our trip, we switched turns as I usually do when I hitchhike with someone. One person talks with the driver, and the other relaxes in the back, so I was in the passenger seat. I think my boyfriend was even dozing off a little bit when the driver started complimenting me and asking about my boyfriend. It was still fine, nothing too weird, and I was just trying to talk to be good company. As we moved on, I started to feel a bit uncomfortable, but I didn't let anything on and only told my boyfriend that we should find truck drivers from our country to make the last part of our trip in one go. I translated this to English immediately because the truck driver became agitated and suspicious of what I was saying. I explained that we were really tired and our plan was to find our truck drivers before he had to take a long break so that we could continue traveling without interruption. We stopped for a short break at a gas station, and my boyfriend decided he was going to look for another truck driver in the parking lot, leaving me with this guy alone. Damn, the truck driver came on to me real hard, and I was scared shitless and didn't fight back. I could feel how aroused he was, and there was no doubt about his intentions. Luckily, my boyfriend was away for just a minute. At that moment, I realized we needed to get out of this situation fast. I didn't want to say anything to my boyfriend because I was scared of how he would react, so I decided to pretend nothing had happened. I was determined to get out at the next stop. We reached a large gas station for truck drivers only and told our driver we were going to look for other drivers heading our way. During our trip to this station, this guy got in touch with another driver, saying he could also take us, maybe one at a time. Damn, I thought, now he's planning a threesome. When I was finally alone with my boyfriend, I remained calm, hinted at what had happened, and insisted that we not stay with this driver no matter what. It took us about 5 minutes to find a group of truck drivers from our country. They were having beers and cracking jokes, and 2 of them agreed to take us. I jumped with joy. We went back to the truck to get our things. The guy had already brought his friend along and was offering my boyfriend to take a shower at the gas station, saying he would pay for him for no obvious reason. He was quite persistent, and as I very well remember, he never offered it to me. Needless to say, these 2 guys were very disappointed to see us go. I still remember how they were looking at me when I was taking our backpacks from the truck. I have never told my ex-boyfriend the details. I was just lucky that we got away from that truck driver, and I think he has never realized how bad the situation was. At that time, I was playing it cool the whole time, but inside, I was shaking. I could see how desperate that truck driver was and how much he wanted to get rid of my boyfriend. I was so angry at myself for staying with him in the truck by myself, but then all of our things were there. I was also angry for not fighting him back, but it was so sudden, and I got really scared. Well, I would never hitchhike alone. I was 18 at the time and had just started college, living out of state on my own for the first time. I had a pretty sheltered life. I am also a female, so my first semester at my out-of-state college had just ended. It was May, and I was on my way home from my brother's wedding. I'm about an hour away from my current residence, with a little over 3 hours left of my trip. Everything is going great, and I'm just cruising with the traffic. It was a notably busy day for that particular stretch of interstate, somewhere on I-40 in Tennessee. As I said, all was well until I checked my mirror. There was a truck a little farther back from the side of my car in the lane next to me. I could see his headlights in my passenger side mirror. I looked up because, even though it was the middle of the afternoon and super sunny out, this dude was flashing his lights at me. I tried to brush it off and assumed he just wanted to get into my lane, so I tried moving. He stayed behind me the whole time, not letting any other cars get between us. He kept flashing his lights at me, and I looked up at him. He waved and honked. This was a red flag, but I took it the wrong way. I thought, oh, I wonder if he's signaling me to pull over. I hope nothing is wrong with my car. The only reason I thought this was because, the week before, I had gotten a hole in my tire and had it patched. I was worried that the patch had fallen out and that my tire was going flat as I traveled. I'm freaking out about my car and plan to pull off at the next exit. Fortunately, it comes up quickly, and there is a gas station with some customers visible from the exit ramp. I head there and pull up at a gas pump. Curiously, the trucker follows me off the interstate and into the same parking lot, but he parks in a designated truck zone. I get out just before he parks and walk around my car, doing a quick inspection. I see him start to get out of his truck, and I decide to buy gas, even though I filled up before I left. As I swiped my card to pay for my gas, the truck driver had reached my car. Lucky for me, since I was already pretty freaked out by him following me off the exit, I had my phone in my hand with 911 already dialed, so I would just have to hit the call button. I left my driver door open and stayed between that and the gas hose, with him standing a few feet away from the back end of my car, the hose separating us. The first thing this guy says to me is, "Well, aren't you a pretty thing?" I'm screaming in my head now, imagining all possible scenarios for an emergency escape. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s and about 170 pounds. Me, I was 18, 125 pounds, without much muscle or fat anywhere on me. I wouldn't have been able to fight back much anyway. I told him thank you. He offered to buy my gas, and I declined, saying my parents gave me money. I was actually worried that he would expect something in return if I had taken his offer. He asked me questions like where I was from, where I was going, etc. Something went off in my head that just said lie, so I did. I didn't tell him what college I really went to, where I was really headed, or what I was doing. Nothing. My gas was done pumping after about a minute. With that, I told him goodbye, jumped in my car, and got out of there. I kept an eye on him as I left, making sure he didn't follow me any longer, and he didn't. I never saw him again. I don't know what he wanted with me that day, whether it was just to tell me how attractive I was or if he had something much worse planned. I really regret not reporting him to the police. Since this incident, I've always been leery of truck drivers. Back in 2013, I had just started an education, and after the first school period, I had to find an internship to progress. At the time, it proved almost impossible to get one, so while I was looking, I decided to take another job just to ensure we had food on the table. After searching for a while, I found out a friend of my fiance's family had his own handicap bus company, a kind of taxi service for wheelchair users or otherwise disabled people, and he needed someone to cover the night shift since it was a bus that had to be on call at least 22 hours a day. Seeing that I'm quite the owl, I immediately told him that I'd be happy to take the job, and after I got the needed license, I was hired. The job was pretty basic: pick up and drop them off where they needed to go, and sometimes use a machine to get wheelchairs up or down some stairs. When there were no trips, I drove to a designated area and did whatever while waiting. I quickly found a truck stop in the area where I could park and catch some Z's. There was a gas station where I could buy coffee in the early hours of the shift. On the other side of the gas station's parking lot, on the opposite side of the truck stop, there was a rundown restaurant with a motel connected to it. To avoid disturbing the sleeping truckers if I got a trip in the middle of the night, I usually parked on the restaurant side. After parking there every night for a while, I noticed one particular room had a lot of people coming and going. In the beginning, I thought nothing of it. Then, one night at the end of summer, while I was half asleep with the windows slightly open, I suddenly heard yelling coming from the motel. A dude came tumbling out of the room and started running. A few seconds later, a big guy came running after him with something in his hand that I could not make out. I thought it was none of my business and went back to my half-sleeping waiting stage. Not much time passed, and my phone went off. I had a trip an hour's drive away, so I turned on the bus and was leaving the parking lot when I saw the big guy coming around the corner. The rest of the night I had back-to-back trips, so I didn't park until I got home. The day after, I didn't get a return to home zone until 2 o'clock or 3 a.m. When I arrived at the parking lot, the area where I used to park had fist-sized rocks strewn all over the place. Not connecting the dots at the time, I just parked a few spots over and started waiting. I fell asleep pretty fast but was jerked back into reality when a car right in front of my bus honked its horn, flashed the high beams, and revved its engine. I thought it was just some idiot who noticed me sleeping and found it funny to try to scare me, so I jumped out of the bus, about to tell him to screw off. But instead of driving off or stopping, the driver made the start brake motion with the car, indicating that I was the one who should screw off. Then I connected the dots. Not wanting to seem like a pushover, I stood still and stared at the car, not that I could actually see anything with the high beams almost blinding me. After what seemed like a really long time, but must not have been more than 30 seconds, the car drove off. After that, I decided to park near the trucks from then on. A month or so passed, and nothing had happened since the car episode. I figured that nothing more would happen if I just kept parking by the trucks. Then, one night, I had a long 12-hour shift on a Sunday, and I didn't have time to eat dinner before work that day. During the first half of my shift, I had back-to-back trips with no time to eat. So when I got a return to home zone, I quickly parked in the far end of the almost empty truck stop and got ready to eat my now very late dinner that my fiancée packed for me. I wanted to watch some TV on my phone while eating, so I sat with my back against the driver's side door and got comfy. While turning my back to the door, I accidentally hit the door lock with my elbow, but that was my luck. As I was sitting there scrolling Netflix on my phone, I suddenly felt the bus rock and heard the clack of the door handle behind me smack back into position. I quickly turned and saw a dude with a hood over his head quickly crouching and proceeding to lay down on the ground and crawl under the bus with a big kitchen knife in his right hand. I quickly got up and made sure the other two doors were locked. Then I looked in all directions to see if I could spot him. He was still under the bus, and I was sure as hell not jumping out this time since the knife made his intentions pretty clear. I turned on the engine, turned on the spots on the back of the bus, and looked around to see if it had scared him off. Lucky for me, it did. I saw him run off into a bushy, woody area at the end of the truck stop. I never parked at that truck stop again after that night, and I made sure all doors were locked every time I was parked. This happened when my now husband and I were moving from the east to the west coast of the U.S. This had been our second time making this trip, and this one was just to pick up a few last things and grab our two dogs. At this point, we were just trying to make good time since we were tired of being on the road and would only stop for food and restroom breaks. So we weren't strangers to rest stops at odd hours of the day. I can't remember what state this happened in because we do a lot of traveling, and rest stops have all blurred together over the years. Anyways, my husband had been driving for a while, and it was time to switch off, walk the dogs, and stretch our legs. So we pulled into a rest stop around 3 o'clock or 4 a.m. There was only one other vehicle in the lot, most likely with someone sleeping inside of it, and not that many truckers in the truck area, so the rest area was fairly empty. I jumped out of the car and let my husband know I was going to run into the restroom before I let the dogs out. While I ran in, he was going to hang out by the car to have a smoke and keep an eye on our dogs. However, we parked our car by the dog area, and to get to the restrooms, you had to walk over this hill. You couldn't see the restrooms from our car. Being late at night, my husband decided to walk most of the way with me to make sure I got there okay. I wasn't worried but didn't mind the extra comfort of having him there. I finished up in the restroom and came out to walk the dogs and let my husband take his restroom break. Even though it was late and I felt a bit cut off from the lighted area of the rest stop, I wasn't worried. I'm small and don't weigh much, but my dogs are German Shepherd mixes and very protective of me. Plus, I was taught self-defense at a young age and feel capable of defending myself if the time came. So I'm walking my dogs and letting them do their business when I noticed that one of the semi-trucks, which had been sitting on the far side of the stop, starts up and slowly drives in my direction. This didn't seem worrisome to me because they were on the trucker's side, and I assumed they were heading to the exit to get back onto the highway. I grabbed 2 doggy bags to clean up after my dogs and started heading to the trash can. As I'm walking, I'm suddenly blinded by bright headlights. I looked in the direction of the lights and saw that the semi, which I thought was leaving, had pulled up as close to the truck lot and car lot divide as possible and now had its brights aimed directly at me. Pissed off that someone was blinding me with their brights, I quickly tossed the poop bags away and started walking back to my car. As I'm walking away, the dude starts flashing his lights over and over again. I'm almost to my car, wondering if I'm missing something and becoming more and more irritated. He starts creeping his truck in my direction again while flashing his lights. My dog sensed my irritation and immediately went on alert, staring in the trucker's direction. I finally made my way to my car, and the guy is still flashing his lights while stopping his truck in my direction again. I don't scare easily, so I decided to stand there and glare in his direction. Then he finally stopped flashing his lights. Good, I assumed he was done and started getting my keys out to unlock the car. Suddenly, my dogs stiffened beside me, their hackles raised, and they began to growl. I heard the sound of a door opening and turned back in the trucker's direction. I saw his door was now opened, and I saw a foot starting to exit the truck. I'm sitting there thinking this guy is a complete idiot when, at this point, my husband shows up and wraps his arm around me while flipping the trucker off. The trucker's foot disappears back into his truck. He shuts his door and leaves the rest stop pretty fast. I told my husband about him flashing his lights, and he explained that truckers use this method to flag women down at rest stops for sex. I was grossed out. I'm guessing he thought I was alone because of how the rest stop was set up. However, I was in no way dressed like someone interested in random sex at a rest stop. I was wearing layers because it was cold and driving a newer car. Plus, what idiot thinks it's a good idea to try to approach someone with 2 huge dogs? Although I was never scared during the whole thing, I do think the situation was creepy because the guy was obviously not quite there and was acting pretty abrasive. A few months ago, I was driving back to school from visiting my parents. It's about a 2-hour drive, so I usually keep myself entertained with music. I'm a 5 feet 3 inches, 21-year-old female driving my dad's little old pickup truck alone in the leftmost lane of a 3-lane highway, dorking around to the music on the radio. Suddenly, I noticed a semi-truck going the exact same speed as me in the rightmost lane. Embarrassed for getting caught in dork mode, I stopped singing and tried to speed up so he couldn't see me anymore. He matched my speed, which ticked me off a little bit, so I looked at the driver, expecting to see some angry jerk. To my surprise, he was smiling and waving. Thrown off, I kind of chuckled and waved back. Big mistake. He moved over to the middle lane to be closer to me and now wouldn't stop smiling and waving. At first, I played nice, waving back a little because a semi-truck beats a tiny pickup truck any day. But I was mostly focusing on getting out of this guy's field of vision safely. I tried speeding up as fast as my truck would allow and slowing down as suddenly as I could without endangering anyone behind me, but he would just match my speed. If there was someone coming up in his lane, he'd move to the right at the last possible second and pass them before I could slow down and get behind them. He has a lot more practice with reckless maneuvering than I do, so he has me trapped and is using other cars to help him. The whole time, he's smiling, waving, and holding up the number 1 sign for some reason I still don't know. His charm is rapidly fading as this continues for about 5 miles. I got worried and called 911. I gave them a description of the truck: white cargo truck, black cab with some Pennsylvania company logo on it, and the driver was a balding, middle-aged tan guy with a dirty blue t-shirt. They advised me to pull off to the emergency shoulder on the left, but I had never done that and it looked too narrow, so I didn't feel comfortable doing that. At this point, he was passing someone else in the middle lane, and I finally had a chance to slow down and merge 2 lanes over to the rightmost lane. I started speeding past him so he couldn't trap me again. The operator told me to take the closest service plaza about 5 miles away. She said he probably wouldn't follow me, so I could stop there for a few minutes before getting back on the highway. She told me to call if he did follow me, but she was confident he probably wouldn't, so she hung up. Now he's still holding up the sign and smiling this creepy, increasingly perverted grin at me while I avoid eye contact. The service plaza is in a quarter mile, and I'm not using any turn signals, but I guess he knew what I was doing because he braked hard and merged behind me right at the last second to join me in exiting to the service plaza. After I got my heart to start back up from the coronary area just experienced, I called 911 again. The way this service plaza was set up was that semi-trucks had to use a separate lane winding to the right of the plaza that led to a parking lot behind the plaza just for big trucks. The rest of us used a smaller lane to park immediately in front of the plaza. I parked, and as I'm explaining to the new operator what's going on, I watched the semi creep around its path while the driver stared me down, smiling. I freaked out. He knew where I had parked. He knew where to find me. If I just stayed there, I thought maybe I could have floored it to get back on the highway, but I was afraid he would see me and follow me again. So, I drove to a gas station to the left of the plaza, which had a view of the semi-truck parking lot, hoping he wouldn't find me until the police came. The operator transferred me to the woman who was helping me before. She informed me that they had dispatched a couple of police cars but couldn't tell me how long they would be. I saw the trucker had gotten out of his truck and was heading towards me. Even though my windows were closed and my doors were locked, I was panicking on the phone with the operator. She told me the police should be there soon and that I should be safe there, so I should sit tight while I kept her updated. I wanted to at least drive back to the parking lot I was in before, but it was a one-way entrance to the gas station, so I couldn't. I glared at the trucker and showed him my phone when he came close. He finally stopped smiling and made it look like he was going into the service plaza. I looked in my right side view mirror and found him hiding behind a big white pillar in front of the plaza, staring at me again. I freaked out and asked the operator where the cops were and if I could leave because he was being ultra creepy. She told me to sit tight again because they should be there any minute, so I did. Then he came out of hiding and started walking towards my truck. I put it in drive just in case and told the operator what he was doing. I refused to make eye contact with him but kept watching my mirrors to make sure I knew where he was. The smile was back, and he started walking in circles around my truck, looking at it as if looking for a way to get in. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until he circled back behind me, floored it, and told the operator I wasn't waiting one more second for the police. She apologized and told me the police would look for the man and talk to him if they found him, and that I should focus on getting home safely while keeping an eye out for him. I don't know if they did that or not, but I know none of that would have happened if I had my boyfriend with me. So not only can't I walk alone, but I also can't drive alone as a female. Nice to know. I've worked in manual labor my entire life, but I took a gig hauling trucks for a few years in the early 2000s. I got an offer for a package that I couldn't refuse in the way of full-time pay with part-time hours if I could meet the arrival times. I got insurance benefits, everything an employee dreams about. I got my commercial driver's license as well as a few other certifications, and found myself on the road just a month or so later. I had a lot of jobs where things got weird or just crazy, but one particular evening makes the others pale in comparison. I don't like stories with a lot of fluff, so I'm just going to jump right into it. I was on a return trip from Oregon to Minnesota. I had already made one delivery, hooked up a second, and was now technically on my way home. This was about the halfway point. Weather was great, I was feeling good and motivated. My time on that trip was well ahead of schedule, so I made sure not to push it or burn myself out. I found it super defeating to get home from a long haul and be too exhausted to enjoy it. It's always better to take a little time and stay level. I also have a bit of a heart condition, so heavy caffeine intake isn't an option for me. Most of my life has been all natural, using whatever remedy I could come up with to keep my energy up. The biggest influence was just a good diet, exercise, and a consistent sleep schedule. That means I stopped every night generally at the same time, got a good amount of rest, and that's it. Many of my trips were clocked to the very last second, but I managed to always arrive on time. I passed over the Idaho border and started gunning through Montana. Lots of beauty, but ultimately not much in the way of civilization out there. The route took me through Missoula and some more established townships. Between them, though, you'd be lucky to find a service station of any kind. Rural stretches like this always kept me on my toes, as I'd heard horror stories about guys running out of gas, blowing tires, or encountering engine trouble. There isn't help for 75 miles in each direction. On top of that, some of these rural stretches don't see a lot of traffic. Some early mornings, I wouldn't see another car on the road for an hour at a time. I had my eyes set on a trucking station out in the middle of nowhere between Bozeman and Livingston. I'd roll through Bozeman around dinner time, grab a quick bite to eat, then push on towards the station. I'd let my food settle and digest a bit. After an hour of driving, I'd hit my target, pull over, and be totally ready for bed. I liked routine, structure, and having a plan. That night, everything was supposed to be simple. At first, it was. My plan was going smoothly. I got dinner, gassed up, experienced little to no traffic, and was back on the road in no time. Soon, I found my head swimming from the digestion and long day of driving. But there it was, some lights out there alongside the highway. You know exactly what I'm talking about, those big concrete pullouts on the side of interstates every 100 miles or so. They usually have a bathroom, vending machine, trash cans, everything people living on the road might need. I pulled in and found a rare sight. Not a single vehicle anywhere. No one was using this rest station, and I liked that. There's a kind of security in being solo, if that makes sense. I let the truck cool down, locked everything up, then crawled into the living space in the back. My area was very simple: a bed, small table attached to the wall, and an overhead shelf to store most of my belongings. I also had a little makeshift power cell which I used to charge a portable flip DVD player that had both the player and a screen. It was one of those inventions of the 2000s that could have only been popular then. I settled in with my big blankets and pillows and watched one of my favorites, Resident Evil or Reign of Fire, an action thriller of some kind. Despite the shooting and explosions, I fell asleep just after 30 minutes. I closed the DVD player and surrendered to the darkness inside my cab. It must have only been a couple hours later when something woke me up. I couldn't place it, but I knew something jarred me. I have a habit of snoring occasionally, and when I do, I sometimes wake myself up with one of those louder rips. I thought maybe that's what happened, so I snuggled in for a few more hours of sleep. I like to hit the road before sunrise and get those extra miles in before the rest of the world wakes up. Just as I closed my eyes though, I heard it, the sound that woke me up. It wasn't a snore like I thought, but the abruptness of a cough. It came from somewhere beyond the cab, outside in the parking lot. It sounded partially muffled, maybe another trucker had pulled in and I just simply hadn't heard the rumble. Really didn't seem that likely, but I guess anything is possible, right? I wanted to be sure of what I heard, so I turned on the small overhead light. The second that flicked on, I could hear shoes slapping the asphalt and the sound of someone running away. As I listened, the footsteps faded a bit. The person was running away from my truck. They must have seen the light come on and reacted to that. But at this point, I'm now on high alert. I turned the light off so as not to give away my position within the truck. As long as it's dark, it's almost impossible to see in the depth of the sleeping cab, so I used that to my advantage. Looking out, I surveyed the parking lot and found something unusual, an older van parked across the lot, sitting angled so the broadside faced my windshield. Definitely weird, as I was 100% alone when I pulled in originally. That parking lot was empty. I tried to be reasonable though. Maybe he was walking his dog, having a smoke. Whatever the case, the person was likely a long-haul traveler just like myself. The guy was probably stretching his legs, doing a few laps of the parking lot when he accidentally woke me up. Once he saw the light, he realized that he made a mistake, then hightailed it back to his van. It really wasn't the most out-of-the-ordinary thing to happen at a truck stop. With a little apprehension, I let everything go and didn't investigate it any further. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't fall back asleep. Just as I started to drift off, I heard those footsteps again, and then what I thought sounded like someone tugging on the passenger side door handle. There was an unmistakable click, then the sway of someone stepping off the sidebar. Whoever I'd heard coughing was just trying to get inside my truck. At this point, all my alarms are going off in my head, and that structured, well-planned part of my brain is now scrambling. For whatever reason, and a lot of my friends have given me flack for it over the years, I didn't carry a gun on these truck hauls. I did have a short club that I used to check my tire pressure, and that was a great second option. At this point, I believed my best choice was to nut up and confront whoever was milling around the parking lot, let them know that my truck wasn't public property. All at once, I threw the passenger door open and clicked my flashlight on. I had a small, steady streamlight that could reach something like 30 yards, not with the puffy yellow flare of a cheap flashlight, but with a white, concentrated light. I swept it back and forth, saw nothing, so I started inspecting the truck and the trailer. I saw nothing at first glance, so I hopped down and did a full lap of the rig. Still nothing, not even underneath it. Only one option left now, time to go look at that van. I swept the flashlight around and started marching up to the rear. I wanted to see the license plate before I checked it out any further. As I went to eye the back of the bumper, I brought my light up so I could see. My eyes naturally went to the license plate, which was from South Dakota, but something else caught my attention. I couldn't place it at first, but as I kept looking, it all came into focus. Below the back of the van, near the far back tire, there was a pair of boots. Someone was crouched and hiding on the other side of it. Only the toe tips poked out, but it was enough for me to see what was going on. I left the light on the boots for 10 to 20 seconds, long enough for them to realize that they were exposed. I watched in disbelief as the boots slowly shuffled backward until they were completely hidden behind the tire. My stomach soured at the whole thing. This person clearly had ill intentions, and I wanted nothing to do with them. I wanted to say something, but I found myself completely speechless. I'm not confrontational. You may have gleaned that from my lack of a firearm. I didn't want to issue a threat to someone who might have the upper hand. I just backed up until I reached my truck, hopped in, and locked the door. I figured that encounter was enough. I got out and found them, who would come up and keep messing with me. We both knew what was going on at this point, so the mystery was completely over. Just some vagrant weirdo looking to make a score. Now that he knew the truck wasn't abandoned, I hoped that he would just move on. I sat for 45 minutes, and that van never moved. I didn't see anything move, no person, no door opening or closing. It's like they were still hiding behind that rear passenger tire. As the morning went on, though, sleep came and kissed me, and I knew I needed to get at least a couple more hours of rest if I wanted to have a successful day. My eyes started to droop, and soon I was snoozing. The sound that woke me this time was clear, loud, and right outside the door. It was the sound of a man clearing his throat, the sound someone makes when they want your attention. My eyes shot up, and I moved to the glass, and there, just peeking over the lip of the door, I can see someone looking into my cab. I freeze, hoping they can't see me, but it doesn't matter. This guy's eyes are rolling back and forth, taking it all in, looking for whoever is inside. He looks crazy, like he'd given himself a haircut with a butter knife. Some of it was shaved, some of it was long, and I could see nicks along his scalp. I think his eyebrows were shaved off too, but it was hard to tell in the moonlight. I could literally feel this guy pulling on the door handle, making the entire truck move. I did the only thing that I could think of, shout as loud as I could. "What do you want?" I hollered at the glass, still motionless in the back of the cab. This is also a censored conversation, as I remember swearing in literally every sentence that I spoke to this guy. He said, "It's me." "Who?" I asked. Okay, maybe this was a case of a mix-up. I sat up and reached for the club on the floor. "It's Henry, come on," he pleaded. "I don't know you. I'm not from here. Now please just get away from my truck," I explained to him. The conversation devolved from that point forward. Playing hard to get. I like it. "Let's do something different," he said. This guy went on at length about what he wanted to do to me. None of it involved violence at all. Everything this guy said was sexual from start to finish. I'm watching this guy lick the window of my semi as he tells me he wants to kiss my feet, worship me, pleasure every part of me. I'm not homophobic, but the whole thing was nauseating. As he's going on and on and on about his sexual fantasies, transitioning into what he wants me to do to him, I'm yelling for him to just please go away. Throughout the entire thing, his tone changes. He starts talking about his desires, which were much more violent. This guy wanted someone to hurt him during their sexual escapades, punched, choked, tied up, and abused, the whole shebang. I couldn't really believe what I was hearing. He switched from licking the window to tapping on it before finally smashing his fist into the glass. I had to do something. I remembered my portable DVD player and, for whatever reason, came up with this weird little plan. I opened it up and faced it away from the front of the cab so the light would illuminate my face, but he wouldn't be able to see what the light was coming from. "I'm calling the police," I said, hoping the light source would look like a car phone or a radio. "I've got your South Dakota plates too." "Nathan?" he asked. "I'm not who you're looking for." "Now get the hell out of here, man," was the last thing that I ever said to this person. I watched him leap down and start running all in one swift motion. The van fired up and, without even turning its headlights on, fled from the parking lot like a bat out of hell. Honestly, I ended up doing the same. After another inspection of the trailer and tires to make sure everything was secure, I rolled out and made for Livingston. That morning, I really played with the idea of calling the police and making some kind of report, but thought it would be more trouble than it was actually worth. I didn't have the actual plate number, just that it was a Dakota van, so I figured my report would go absolutely nowhere. It wasn't until I got out of trucking that I realized how common this type of encounter was, especially after the invention of Craigslist. Truck stops have always been known for midnight rendezvous, but became explicit for random hookups all over the country, particularly for traveling men who wanted to experiment. Whoever that Henry guy was, he thought I was Richard, who was probably another trucker rolling through Montana that night. Henry must have gotten the truck station mixed up, or Richard was late to the arrival, so he got us confused. Regardless and whatever the case, I'm very glad that I had my doors locked that night, as I could be telling a very different story right now. Have a plan when you hit the road and always stick to that plan. When I was 18, I was very immature and naive. I was kind of a jerk when I was on the road, honking whenever I got impatient, borderline cutting people off. Looking back now, it was very stupid. If I ever have kids, I'll be that much more strict with them as far as their driving. That being said, I did drive a lot for someone my age. I went away to school 5 hours away from home. No matter what day of the week, traffic always gets atrocious the closer I get to home. So during breaks, I'll drive home at night to avoid this. What goes from a 4 to 5 hour drive down to a 3-hour drive? It was the beginning of winter break as the fall semester just ended. All my friends left for home on the same day. I just waited till later on in the night to head out because there's nothing I hate more than traffic. I used to drive a Mazda 3 that I would beat the ever-living crap out of, and admittedly, I used to be known for driving my car to a near-empty tank consistently. People would comment on it whenever they'd be in the car with me, and I'd always assure them that the car would still have at least 30 miles to go even after the needle would hit E. I found out the night I was driving home from school that I was wrong. I was only like an hour into my drive on the interstate. The needle was on E, and I was pushing my luck waiting for a gas station sign instead of looking up the nearest one on the map. The car started making these weird sounds suddenly and jolting, and that's when I realized I may have actually run the tank empty this time. I got off the first exit ramp and hoped it would lead right to a gas station. This exit was dark though, with no street lights, and there were just woods on either side. I was scared to slow down and lose my speed because I didn't know if I'd have enough gas to find a gas station. I blew through the stop sign at the end of the ramp and made a sharp left turn on the intersecting road, which was another dark road surrounded by woods. I was screwed. The car eventually came to a stop, and the engine died. Things only got worse when I took out my phone and saw I had no bars. I have T-Mobile, which is the worst possible reception anywhere far from a major city. I tried calling 911 because I was stupid and thought that 911 works even without reception. Of course, it didn't. I was terrified because I didn't know what to do. I turned on my hazard lights and just waited for someone to pass by. It was a long time before I saw headlights approaching. When I did, I flashed my headlights at them, and they passed me, made a U-turn, then pulled up on the grass behind me. I didn't know who was getting out of that car, though, and I was an 18-year-old defenseless girl. I just cracked the window down a little bit as this man approached my car. I told him I needed help. I ran out of gas. He offered to give me a ride to the nearest gas station. He was this bald guy with glasses on. He kind of looked trustworthy. I had no other apparent options but to accept his offer. I got out of the car and followed him to his car, making sure to lock my doors first. His car was a black Honda, year probably a 2010. It smelled funky in his car. I couldn't pin what the smell could be, though. He banged another U-turn and started driving in the direction he was driving before. He made conversation with me, asking where I was from and basic questions. I was honest with him that I was driving home from school. He said he lived in the area and that they don't get too many out-of-towners getting off the interstate for this quiet little town. The route we were taking lacked any buildings anywhere. It was just woods everywhere. I asked if he knew of any gas stations, and he said yeah, just a ways up the road. I started hearing bumping and thumping coming from the back of the vehicle. It sounded like the trunk. At first, I thought it was maybe just bumps in the road or a loose object in the trunk. He seemed to keep talking like he wouldn't stop. Finally, we got to a sort of town-looking area. There were some lights and buildings at last, a diner, and a few small houses. There was a red light at the first intersection since I got in his car. We came to a stop, and for the first time, there was silence. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone screaming in the trunk, followed by thumps and bangs. I looked at the man, who looked at me. In a split second, I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened the door, and ran while at the same time, he tried grabbing me and pulling me back into the car. I heard him get out as well, but instead of chasing me, he ran to close his passenger side door. Then I heard him floor it down the street. I ran into the diner and asked for help, making a scene. I used their phone to call 911. I waited there, and it became this whole huge thing with multiple police showing up to the diner to take a report. Given the gravity of the report that I was making, that I heard someone in the trunk of the car, they had to get every last detail for me about the man's car, his appearance, and where he picked me up. I was also given a ride back to my car so that they could also include the pickup location in the report. They also helped me get a hold of AAA, which eventually would come to my location to fill my car with gas. This was overall the scariest experience of my life. I was shaken to the core the whole rest of the ride home. I hope they found that man. I hope whoever was in that trunk is still alive today. For all I know, that man could have been bringing me to his house or somewhere else, and I was just lucky I had a chance to get out at that red light. I live in Burke County, North Carolina, in Morganton. I'm used to the quiet lifestyle that comes with living in a rural place. You get some weird characters here and there, but it's usually nothing too bad. I own a nice plot of land with my husband. My work schedule fluctuates. Sometimes I work days, sometimes I work nights. This happened on a night that I was on my way home after a night shift, so it had to be like 4 a.m. My phone was almost dead. I was hungry. I was tired, and I just wanted to get some food and head home. I stopped at the gas station to get $10 worth of gas and also a packaged sandwich, which I proceeded to eat inside the gas station cafe. Some sketchy guy was eyeing me for a little until he left the building without buying anything. After eating, I went outside to fill up the gas and then got back in the car. The smell of gas was extra pungent for some reason. These roads are very dark and twisty at night, so I was driving slow, especially since I was tired after a long day of work. Then something unexpected happened. The needle on the gas gauge suddenly dropped to E, and the low gas light came on and beeped. I had no idea what was going on. I'm not a car person and I'd never run out of gas before this. Plus, the needle just suddenly dropped. I thought at first that the computer was glitching, so I pulled over and restarted the car, but the needle was still on E. I tried to continue driving, but the engine died. I started having a panic attack. I called my husband first thing, and thank God he picked up. I asked him how did my car run out of gas after I just filled up, and as I got out of the car, I smelt gasoline. I told him this, and he said it sounds like I have a leak. He told me he'd head right over and he'd call our roadside assistance company. But then I heard a car coming with no headlights, and suddenly it stopped not far behind my car. I suddenly thought to bring up that sketchy guy who was watching me at the gas station and asked my husband if there was a chance he did something to my car. My husband's tone suddenly changed to sounding more concerned and worried. He said yes, there's a chance that he may have cut my fuel line. I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was I needed to run. I took my keys out of the ignition and shut the door and locked it so that the headlights would turn off. My phone was on like 2%, so I told him to text me when he's close. I ran off the road and towards the first house I could find. I ran down the long driveway and up the property to the front door. All the lights in the house were off. I still rang the bell multiple times anyway. Eventually, a light turned on and then the door opened. A man in his 60s opened the door. He looked like he was just woken up. I asked him to let me in to hide and charge my phone. After a bit of explaining, he opened the door fully and let me in. I asked him for an iPhone charger, and he said he'd go look for one, then asked me to take a seat in the living room. I sat down, still in my nurse scrubs, feeling a mix of emotions. The man called out from the kitchen asking me if I wanted some water. I said yes, please. Little did he know, I saw his reflection in a mirror in the living room that gave visibility into the kitchen. I saw him fill a cup with water, then I know for a fact I saw him drop something into the water. He walked out of view of the mirror, but the faucet was still running. It ran for a solid 30 more seconds before he turned it off. He came back into the living room with a glass of water and handed it to me. I thanked him, and he sat down and just looked at me, then asked me to explain the situation again. I replied to him, I just really need a charger so that I could contact my husband. He said all right and went upstairs. I checked my phone, and it was on 1%. I used that remaining battery to send my current location to my husband just in case. I then smelt the glass of water, and although it didn't smell like anything, I knew he put something in it. Now I had to make the decision of whether I should leave or not. On one hand, I needed to charge my phone badly. On the other, I was 99% sure he did something to this water. I heard him walking back down the stairs, and he said he doesn't have any iPhone chargers since he has an Android. After he said this, I got up and walked straight for the door. I'm not an idiot. Once outside, I ran back down the driveway to the road. I felt like throwing up. I couldn't believe two separate potential incidents from two different men happened in one night. I crept along the side of the road behind the trees. I took out my phone and sent my updated location, and right around now was when my battery died. I waited until I saw the familiar headlights of my husband's truck. I went out waving my arms, and thank God it was him. I got inside the truck and let all my emotions out, crying to him about what I just went through. He brought us to my car, and there was no longer a car behind mine. My back window was shattered, though, and it appeared someone had gotten into the back seat, but nothing of high value was left in my car to steal anyway. My car battery was also now dead. When I told my husband about the man who tried to potentially drug me, he was so furious he wanted to go break down his door. But I told him no, let's just wait for the tow truck to come. We waited quite a while before it came. My car was towed to my dealership, where they would take the car in the next day. My husband was right. My car was vandalized, and the fuel line was cut completely. Thank God I was off the next few days because I needed some time to mentally recover from this night. The idea that twice in one night I was almost a victim of some sketchy men, I just couldn't get over. This happened way back in 2006. I was 17 and living in Uvalde, Texas, a very low-income neighborhood, the kind you'll find sprawled out all over the place in rural Texas when you're not right outside of a city. The closest city to me was San Antonio. I was going to some local community college because that's all my parents could afford for me. One of my best friends from high school, Bodie, moved to San Antonio to go to San Antonio College. He was living in some small apartment a little outside of the city with a roommate. His girlfriend would also often stay with him. Since the city is only really an hour and a half away, I would visit him all the time. He invited me this one weekend to come crash for the night, so I took my trusty old 1995 Toyota pickup truck. Just kidding. The thing was a piece of crap. The gas gauge didn't even work on it. I'd have to always just keep track of when the last time I filled the tank up was, then reset the trip mileage. I took Route 90, which was a straight shot from Uvalde to San Antonio. I was on the road at like 2:40 p.m. on a Friday, and there was no traffic at all. I got to Bodie at a reasonable time. His girlfriend wouldn't be getting there until tomorrow, so tonight we were going to go out. We stopped at a liquor store and drank in his apartment for a while with his roommate. Then the three of us went to this dive bar that would kind of look the other way with fake IDs. That was basically our night. We got back to their apartment around 2 a.m. after getting food. I slept on the couch. The next day would have almost been the same thing, but Bodie and his girlfriend were having issues all day. As the two of them got drunker as the night progressed, she started yelling at him in front of me, and it got really awkward and uncomfortable. I didn't really have much to drink that day because I was already iffy about staying the night with her there. I eventually decided I would just head back home. I said goodbye to everyone and started my journey home. It was very late at night. I want to guess midnight, maybe a little earlier. Route 90 was deserted at this time, so I would fly for my pickup standards. But suddenly, the engine started sputtering. I felt my heart completely drop as I realized I forgot to fill up the tank. I slowed down, but it was too late. The engine cut. I pulled to the side of the road and tried starting it a few times, but it did no good. I took out my cell phone, which was equally as shitty as my truck, and tried to get a signal. No shot. I couldn't even call for help. I had to just put my hazards on and hope a good Samaritan would pass. You wouldn't believe how long I sat on the side of the road before seeing headlights. I waved my arms as the car approached, but it zoomed past me, ignoring me. This happened again after another 10 minutes or so. I was starting to feel hopeless, like maybe I should just sleep in my car and wait till sunrise to get help. So that's what I was going to do. I got inside my car, took the key out of the ignition to cut the battery, and just angled my seat back to go to sleep. I would hear the occasional car zooming past, like once every 10 minutes, but it didn't feel worth waving people down in the dark. It seemed sketchy for myself and to the people in the cars. But when I was starting to actually drift away to sleep, a car door closing from behind me woke me up. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a car pulled up behind me with its headlights off. I turned around now to get a better look. There was some big pickup truck, but I couldn't see anyone inside of it, nor did I see anyone outside of it. Maybe someone pulled over to help. I got out of the car and said, "Excuse me," to no response. I walked closer to the truck just to confirm no one was inside. Then I walked back to my car. This was weird. I looked towards the trees on the side of the road. Maybe someone was pissing in the woods. I went back inside my car and locked the door. This was just too weird. Suddenly, there was a tap at my window. I jumped. I looked to see a man looking down at me into the car, smiling. I didn't do anything yet. He said, "Hey, buddy, need a hand?" I lowered the window a crack and said, "Hey, I ran out of gas." The man said, "That's quite the predicament. Step out and give me a hand with this real quick." When he said this, I thought he meant help him with a gas jug to fill up my tank or something, honestly. So I stepped out of the truck and shut the door, expecting him to lead me to his truck. But he stood there, looked down at me because he was much taller, still smiling, and said, "I need you to empty your pockets, please." It took me a second to process what he meant. I was literally a broke college student driving a piece of pickup truck. I wasn't about to get robbed of the only cash I had in my phone. I ran for it in the direction of the trees. I'm small but fast. I turned around and saw he was chasing after me. Once I made it into the trees, I zigzagged all over the place until I seemed to lose him. Then I crouched behind a big tree to catch my breath. When I heard him approaching closer, I quieted my breath. I heard him say out loud, "I'll kill you, you piece of." I don't know if he was just saying it out loud out of anger or if he wanted me to hear it, but I was too scared to move. Even after I heard his footsteps move away, I didn't move. In fact, I stayed in this position the rest of the night, eventually laying behind this big tree up until dawn. I went back over to the highway to my truck, and the truck behind me was gone, but my truck's doors were both open. I found that my glove box had been gone through and completely emptied of anything somewhat valuable. My flannel hoodie was also taken, which had something in the pocket, I'm sure. I finally managed to wave down a good Samaritan, and he gave me a ride to the closest gas station. I bought a fuel can, filled it with gas, and the man brought me back to my car, where I filled my tank just enough to drive the truck to a gas station to fill up completely. Then I went straight home. This was a real-life learning experience for me, that there are bad people out there who will try to take advantage of you when you're in a vulnerable spot. But there are also good people, like the man who helped me. Our first story takes place under the unforgiving glare of the desert sun. Miles and miles of sand stretch in every direction, baking under the intense heat. Imagine finding yourself stranded in this desolate landscape, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through the dunes. This is the nightmare that became a reality for one unfortunate traveler. He had been driving for hours, the monotony of the road lulling him into a false sense of security. He had ignored the gas gauge, its needle dipping dangerously low, too focused on reaching his destination. Then it happened. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving him in stunned silence. He was stranded miles from civilization, the nearest town nothing more than a dot on a map he'd hastily consulted hours ago. Panic began to set in, a cold dread creeping up his spine as the gravity of the situation sunk in. The sun beat down relentlessly, the heat radiating off the sand making the air shimmer. He had a meager supply of water, a granola bar, and the clothes on his back. Hope, it seemed, was in short supply. Days turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The relentless sun sapped his energy, the scorching sand burned his skin. He rationed his water, each sip a precious commodity, but dehydration was a constant threat. The vastness of the desert mocked him, a desolate wasteland stretching endlessly towards the horizon. As darkness fell, the desert transformed into a chilling tableau. Gone was the oppressive heat, replaced by a bone-chilling cold that cut through his thin clothing. The silence was broken only by the howl of the wind, a mournful sound that echoed his growing despair. He huddled in his car, a meager shelter against the elements, with fear as his only companion. Days turned into nights, each one blurring into the next, a terrifying cycle of scorching days and freezing nights. His hope dwindled with each passing hour, replaced by a gnawing fear that he wouldn't make it out alive. He had become a prisoner of the desert, trapped in a desolate wasteland with no escape. One day, while stumbling through the sand, his vision blurred from dehydration, he spotted something in the distance. Was it a mirage, a cruel trick of his exhausted mind? As he stumbled closer, his heart pounding in his chest, he realized with a surge of hope that it was a road, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desolate landscape. With renewed determination, he dragged his weary body towards the road, each step a victory against the relentless grip of the desert. As he finally reached the roadside, he collapsed, his body spent, his spirit broken but not extinguished. He had escaped the clutches of the desert, a survivor of a terrifying ordeal. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the unforgiving nature of the desert, a place where running out of gas can be a matter of life and death. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the will to survive, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Our next story takes us from the desolate expanse of the desert to the claustrophobic darkness of a dense forest. Imagine the towering trees, their branches intertwined overhead, creating a canopy that blots out the moon and stars. The air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a symphony of rustling leaves and the snapping of twigs. It's a place of eerie beauty, but also one that can hide unspeakable horrors. A young woman driving home from a late-night shift found herself lost on a deserted road cutting through the heart of such a forest. She had taken a wrong turn, lured off the main highway by a faulty GPS signal. Now she was hopelessly lost, her phone showing no bars, and her car sputtering its last breaths as it ran out of gas. The engine died, plunging her into an oppressive silence broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her heart. The forest, once beautiful, now loomed around her, menacing and alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sounded like approaching footsteps. She knew staying in her car was her safest bet, but the silence of the forest was unbearable, a suffocating blanket of darkness pressing in on her. She turned on her hazard lights, there blinking a beacon of hope in the vast darkness, but the battery quickly drained, leaving her once again in darkness. Time crawled by, each minute an eternity. She dozed off, only to be jolted awake by nightmares fueled by her isolation and fear. The forest came alive with every gust of wind, the shadows seeming to dance and writhe, taking on menacing shapes in the darkness. Then she heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the woods surrounding her car. Her blood ran cold, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. She strained to listen, her senses on high alert, every muscle in her body tense with fear. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the distinct sound of heavy footsteps crunching on leaves. Something was out there, something big and dangerous, circling her car like a predator stalking its prey. She locked the doors, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the lock. She huddled in the back seat, her eyes wide with terror, her breath catching in her throat. The growls continued throughout the night, each one sending shivers down her spine. She was trapped, hunted by an unseen terror in the heart of the forest. As dawn broke, the growls finally ceased, replaced by the chirping of birds, a jarring contrast to the nightmares she had just endured. She cautiously got out of the car, her legs shaking, her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. She didn't waste any time. With a desperate prayer, she started walking, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth and her ears straining for any sound that might signal the return of her unseen tormentor. After what felt like an eternity, she stumbled out of the woods and onto a dirt road. A pickup truck soon approached, its driver stopping to help. She had escaped the clutches of the forest, but the terror of that night, the memory of the unseen growls, would forever haunt her dreams. Our final story takes us to a desolate stretch of highway, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a barren landscape. This is not a road frequented by travelers. The few gas stations that dotted its length had long since been abandoned, their pumps dry and their windows boarded up like hollow eyes staring out at the emptiness. A young couple, eager for a weekend getaway, found themselves stranded on this forgotten highway. Their car sputtered its last as the gas gauge hit empty. They had ignored the warning signs, the lack of other cars, the eerie silence that hung heavy in the air, too caught up in their own excitement to heed these signs. Now, they were stranded. The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, the air thick with the smell of dust and despair. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. They were alone, utterly alone, in a place that felt forgotten by time. They decided to walk, hoping to find help, a glimmer of hope in this desolate landscape. Mile after mile, they walked, the sun beating down on them relentlessly. Their throats were parched, their energy draining with each step. The highway stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt leading nowhere. As they walked, they noticed something strange, cars abandoned on the roadside, seemingly frozen in time. Some were old and rusted, others surprisingly new, their paint still gleaming under the harsh sun. Each car was eerily empty, their interiors undisturbed, as if their occupants had vanished into thin air. Fear, primal and instinctive, began to creep into their hearts. The silence of the highway was no longer just unnerving, it was oppressive, heavy with an unseen menace. They quickened their pace, their eyes darting nervously at the abandoned vehicles, their minds conjuring up terrifying scenarios. As dusk approached, casting long eerie shadows across the highway, they stumbled upon a small town. Relief washed over them, a beacon of civilization in this desolate wasteland. But as they approached, their relief turned to horror. The town was deserted, buildings stood empty, their windows dark and lifeless. The streets were eerily silent, not a single soul in sight. It was as if the entire town had simply vanished, leaving behind an unsettling silence that spoke volumes. They pressed on, desperation fueling their steps, their senses on high alert and their hearts pounding in their chests. The town was like a ghost town, frozen in time, its silence amplifying their growing fear. As darkness fell, they came to a crossroads. In the fading light, they saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. Relief flooded them, a glimmer of hope in this desolate landscape. They called out, but the figure remained motionless, its back to them. As they drew closer, their hearts sank. The figure was a scarecrow, its straw-stuffed body dressed in tattered clothing, its painted face twisted into a grotesque grin. It was a cruel joke, a symbol of their isolation and despair. They collapsed on the roadside, their bodies spent, their spirits broken. They were trapped in a nightmare, a desolate highway populated by abandoned cars and ghost towns. Their hope, once a flickering flame, now threatened to be extinguished by overwhelming despair. Looks like there's a storm approaching. I glanced out the window of the car and looked behind us as my fiancée, Kiva, came out of the shop with a bag of snacks for our trip. The sky looked gray just a few feet behind us down the road. I heard low rumbling as Kiva opened the driver's side door and got in. "Do you think the roads will get bad?" I asked her. She glanced behind us for a few seconds before turning on the engine. The 80s station we had been listening to on our road trip turned on, and the music filled the car as Kiva pulled out of the gas station parking lot. "We can always pull over if they do," she replied. "Don't you think we should fill up on gas soon?" I asked. "I think we should be fine for now." I glanced over at the dashboard. "There's a quarter of a tank left," I noted. "Babe, it's fine. Trust me. You worry too much. Besides, that's more than a quarter." I sighed as I tried not to let it bug me. I hated getting lower than half a tank in my own car. It stressed me out to no end. We pulled out onto the road, and I grabbed my phone. As I opened the weather app, I looked at the forecast for the day, sunny with a high of 95. That couldn't be right. I made sure that I had cell service before opening the app again, thinking that maybe it would refresh. It didn't, and the forecast still said the same. "Huh," I said. "That's weird." "What's weird?" Kiva asked. I looked in the side mirror at the darkening skies behind me. The clouds were catching up to us quickly. "Melanie," I glanced back at Kiva. "The weather app says it's supposed to be sunny today. Maybe the app is down." "Yeah, maybe," I replied. We continued down the road and stopped at a red light. I shifted in my seat so I could look behind us at the approaching storm. I could see the dark clouds moving across the sky, heading directly towards us. I turned back to face the road ahead of us when suddenly the sound of thunder boomed across the sky. I jumped as it was followed by a flash of lightning. All of a sudden, a scream erupted behind us. "What was that?" Kiva asked. Oh my God, what the," someone yelled. The people in the cars around us began to roll down their windows to get a better view of whatever was happening. Kiva shifted the car into park and undid her seatbelt as she opened the door and stepped out of the car. I followed, walking between the traffic. As I followed Kiva, there was a crowd forming a few feet away where an old woman was crying and shouting nonsense. I looked up at the sky again and noticed that the gray clouds were even closer now, and I couldn't see anything in the distance anymore. I glanced back towards the car and then up at the traffic light, which was now green. No one was driving off yet, though, as everyone had gotten out of their cars to investigate. Suddenly, the loud sound of crushing metal caught my attention. As I looked towards the sound, a white pickup truck had been almost completely crushed. I squinted to get a closer look and noticed that there seemed to have been a person inside the truck when it was flattened, and their blood and insides covered the windshield. I looked away quickly as I took deep breaths, trying not to gag. Other people had started to walk toward the crushed truck, and some were gagging and backing up as they realized what they were seeing. "What did?" someone screamed again. The sound of crushing metal was heard, and the second car had been crushed. This time, it had only been the hood of the car that had been crushed, and the driver ran out to look at the damage. "Get back in your cars now," someone screamed. I locked eyes with Kiva, and we ran to the car, getting in and slamming the doors shut. As Kiva shifted back into drive and managed to pull in between the cars and speed through the intersection, I kept looking behind us as the clouds continued to approach. I could see raindrops now. Some of the people had made it away just in time, and others got caught in the rain. The sound of multiple cars being crushed filled the street as Kiva sped down the road. Luckily for us, it was mainly empty. I held on to the armrest as Kiva kept speeding. "Is that the rain doing that?" I asked, glancing back again. "I think so," Kiva muttered. She continued to drive, hyper-focused on the road. I glanced over at the speedometer. She was going almost 90. I looked over at the side of the road as we passed a speed limit sign but said nothing. I looked back at the approaching storm. The rain had picked up excessively, and all of the trees and stop lights had been crushed. They were now crumpled up in the middle of the road, blocking anyone else from escaping the storm. As I glanced down in the rearview mirror, I noticed that most of the road was gone too. There were giant holes everywhere, making it impossible to drive on. My body flung forward as Kiva hit the brakes. All of a sudden, the sound of the screeching brakes and the tires on the road filled my ears as she tried to stop the car. She exclaimed, and the car finally came to a stop. I looked over at her. "Why are you stopping?" She motioned towards the road where there was a giant tree branch blocking the way. "Help me move it, hurry." I jumped out of the car and helped her push the branch out of the way. As we pushed, I couldn't help but glance toward the storm, which was still rapidly approaching. The rain was also picking up, and it seemed like we were right, the rain was to blame. I used all my strength to push on the branch as Kiva pulled, and we finally got it out of the way. We ran back to the car and I glanced back to see the rain approaching. As the first drop of rain landed on the roof of a small convenience store on the side of the road, it all crumbled to the ground. I slid into the seat of the car. "What do you think happens if it lands on someone?" I asked. Kiva turned to look at me. She opened her mouth to speak but didn't get to, as she glanced out one of the back windows. I followed her gaze and saw a man walking down the side of the road. In a split second, the rain caught up. 1 second he was there, and the next second, there was a splatter of blood and human insides on the sidewalk. "I guess that's your answer," Kiva said as she started driving again. I turned around in my seat to keep an eye on the storm. It seemed that the winds had started to pick up, and I could hear them whistling as Kiva continued to drive. "It's getting faster," I replied. She said nothing, but I could feel the speed of the car picking up. We'd been on the road for about half an hour now, and the storm seemed to consistently pick up speed with each second that passed. I couldn't stop myself from looking back at the approaching storm and all of the damage that the rain had done. We'd seen it crush a few more people as it passed through. I don't know how long this storm is going to last or how far out it's going to travel, I thought. but I'm hoping that I can at least warn a few people. Maybe you can make a plan to outrun it. We're going to run out of gas soon, and there's no way that we would have enough time to stop and fill up on gas without the storm catching up to us and crushing our car, and then us. I don't know what we're going to do. We haven't even passed another car that we could potentially steal to try to outrun the storm. I don't know if anyone will even see this or how this will even help, but if you start to see the storm approaching, start running. We started in New Jersey, where we are from, and made our way west. It was a great time. We saw stuff that we always talked about seeing. After day 3, we finally hit the dreaded boring part of the drive, Nebraska. Nothing but cornfields as far as the eye can see. It was about 6:30 p.m., and the sun was starting to set. I looked at the gas gauge, and it read 1/4 of a tank. I told my buddy we should start looking for a gas station. He checked the GPS, and nothing for at least 100 miles showed up. I started to get nervous because the last thing we need is to run out of gas in the middle of Nebraska with literally nothing around at night. That's how horror movies start. Finally, as we crested a small hill, my fears, at least for the time being, were put to rest. Down the road, maybe half a mile, we saw a blue sign that said, "Gas next exit." Little did I know that the next exit was another 30 miles away. So we drove and drove, all the while with one eye on the gauge. Finally, we saw the exit and got off. The gas light on the dashboard came on, warning us we had less than a gallon left. The sign pointed to the right at the end of the exit ramp and said, 10 miles gas. The car we were driving was a 200 Ford Explorer. Being an old SUV, I knew it barely got 14 miles to the gallon on a good day. I shared a look with my friend, we both shrugged. I made the turn, and we continued on. The sun had now gone down, and for those of you who have never been to the Midwest at night, it's not like being in the city. When the sun goes down, there is no ambient light whatsoever. No street lights, no lights from a major city giving off the comfortable orange glow, nothing. Just an endless darkness in all directions. Even the highway offered no lights. I turned on the high beams and could barely see 50 feet in front of me. My spider sense was tingling at this point, but we pressed on. What other choice did we have? Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. I kept my eyes peeled for any possible animals that might dart out in front of me. Suddenly, the car started to shudder. My friend and I both shared an "oh, look" as we started going up another hill. The car barely made it up and crested the hill. As we did, we saw our salvation, lights from a gas station. If I had only known what was going to happen next, I would have gotten out of the car and run back to the interstate. We rolled down the hill and entered what I can only describe as a ghost town. There were buildings, shops, and houses, every single one of them boarded up. There was one exception, a church sat opposite the station. One of those old ones you would usually see in New York or Paris. It appeared to be sandstone with a huge steeple. It looked like it was brand new, with a nicely manicured lawn and a huge red wooden door. The stained glass windows that lined the outside had pictures telling a story. However, instead of telling the story of the Stations of the Cross or the Virgin Mary, as most churches had, these showed depictions of people burning in fire, their faces twisted in agony under the cloven hoof of what I could only think was the devil. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something here just didn't feel right. The car died about 500 feet from the gas station, so we got out and pushed it the rest of the way. As we got out, I heard something barely audible, almost like a humming, coming from the church. My buddy didn't hear anything, so I assumed I must just be tired. The pump was new, with one of the credit card readers, which struck me as odd, considering everything else in this town, save the church, looked like it hadn't had anyone living in it for at least 30 years. We filled up without incident, and as we finished, the sound, which now sounded like a humming droning, got louder. We got back into the car and left. The road we came in on was a one-way, so the only way out was to go further into the town and hopefully find a road that led back to the interstate. As we drove, we saw more light being reflected off the buildings. We pulled into a town square where there was a huge stage and hundreds of chairs set up for what looked like a concert of some sort. The light was coming from a bonfire in the center of the audience area. As we pulled further into the square, we could see a guy playing music for no one. There wasn't one person in any of the seats. I used to work in the music industry. I know a sound check when I see one. Usually, that happens before the concert, so a musician can check his or her sound with the guy running the soundboard. With no one around, this was not it. He was covered in sweat, screaming his music and playing almost like his life depended on it. We came to a T intersection and a stop sign. We had the windows down because it was summer and we were trying to save gas by not using the AC. The droning humming I heard had gotten louder. It was almost like it was in my head, beating my brain. Now it sounded like it was coming from the buildings themselves. It got louder and louder. The guy playing music screamed even louder, almost like he was fighting the sound. Then a whole lot of things happened at once. The humming reached fever pitch and then stopped abruptly. The bonfire went out. The guy on stage stopped playing. Down on the right of the road, which looked like it was the only way back to the highway, came a mob of people with pitchforks, boards, rocks, and one guy had what looked like a samurai sword. Looking back now, I remember thinking it strange that no one had a gun considering where we were. They came running towards us, screaming and waving their weapons. My buddy and I covered our heads in anticipation of the beating of our lives. They started pounding on the car, even going so far as to break one of the little windows in the back seat. I threw the car in four-wheel drive and slammed the accelerator. The car lurched forward, plastering a few people onto the windshield, but ultimately we broke through the mob. The ones who weren't knocked down from the impact of the car started storming the stage. They jumped onto it and started assaulting the musician with their weapons, his screams echoing off the derelict buildings. I didn't waste any time. I slammed on the gas pedal, cut the wheel, and sped out down the road to the right, the whole time with my friend screaming obscenities. We got back to the highway and drove for another 30 miles until we hit our destination for the night, where our hotel was. We got into our room, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. As I put my bags down, I looked at my friend and he looked at me. We both agreed to go to the police in the morning, as it was now about 3 a.m. The next day, we woke up, packed our overnight bags, and went out to our car. We immediately drove to the police department and asked to speak to a detective, as we had a crime to report. A small bald man from a desk stood up and invited us to come and sit with him. We then proceeded to tell him the whole thing. When we were finished, he asked us, pale as a ghost, "Did you tell anyone else this?" We, of course, responded in the negative, to which he replied, "Good. Keep it that way." With his hands shaking, he showed us the door, and we left. We never spoke of it to anyone else. Immersed between the pines, that was the predicament I currently ended up in, an empty highway spanning miles and miles through one of the most desolate roads in the Rocky Mountains. How long had it been since I was at Jim's Diner, looking at the sky gray and foreboding, obvious that a storm was on the horizon. There was that smell in the air, sulfur, between the heat of the afternoon and the sudden chill. I could even feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Trapped on this highway, with no exit for 40 miles, no car or truck for at least 2 hours, and my bike broken down. Wonderful, I muttered, exasperated. Could today get any worse? I had run out of gas. There were some farmlands a few miles back, lost to the oncoming darkness and surrounding sea of pines. The odd feeling, beyond the sense of being completely alone, was that of truly being alone. No chirp or buzz, even howling, that would animate these mountains, beyond the roar of tires and horns, like life itself had found residence elsewhere, leaving me in this impersonation of the world I once was in. Climbing up the hill, feeling the first drops of rain hitting my leather jacket, I felt the first tinge of fear. Until the end of the hill, I saw an exit, plain as day. The name of the town was Padua, the other name was scribbled out. Padua, I thought. Beggars can't be choosers. The walk didn't take as long as I expected it would. The cut into the pines led to a town trapped in another time. Not a ghost town from the last century with broken-down ranches and general stores, but a town that looked like a postcard from the 50s. That retro look was long associated with the big bop monster movies and drive-in theaters. There was only one problem with the site: not a single soul, nor a single car, was moving throughout the town. Instead, there was only the same silence I had heard throughout the mountain highway. There wasn't much more to think about. I resolved to explore the town as it started to come more into view with each step and push. There was a gas station not too far away, a diner down the block, and, from the looks of it, a hotel in the center between the two. I should name this town Lucky Break. "Hello," I called out, standing at the gas station, my bike parked at a stall. No dust, the pumps were on but locked. Walking into the store, which was open, the lights flickered almost as a response. Anyone here? The store was completely packed full of food and drinks, just no worker. Maybe he's on break, I muttered to myself, trying not to dissect the logic any further. I grabbed a protein bar and a bottle of water. It was still cold and fresh to the touch. There was a feeling that I was being watched. Maybe it was just the eerie feeling of being alone. As the doors shut behind me, I could have sworn I saw a shadow sitting at the register. When I did a double take, I found the store completely empty. Drinking the water and chewing on the bar, it had been hours since I had eaten or drunk anything. I released the trigger to let the gas pump start. There wasn't any other way I knew how to get it to work, no credit card slot, no manual pump on the outside. Must be an older job. When I finished filling up the bike, I took in the scenery and watched the clouds. The bike came to life, and I looked around, still feeling that sense of not being alone. "Oh well," I spoke aloud as I entered the empty street. I decided that, while it was only slightly drizzling, I might as well explore the town. Spanning only a few blocks, lights were on in most buildings. However, there wasn't a sign of a single human, animal, or even insect. Like a model or a set of a movie left alone, tomorrow they'd come back and start again. There were a few buildings I tried. I needed a bathroom anyway. A few cloth shops, nothing that I needed or wanted. Being on a bike limits what can be carried. Then there was a library, stacked with books. There was a theme I noticed, not thanks to the books, but the periodicals. Nothing past the date of 1958. That didn't make sense. The last article read about the local football team going off to take the championship on October 21st. What happened October 22nd? There was too much to think about. The only thing that mattered was finding shelter and maybe getting a proper dinner. In all this commotion, I realized leaving the library that I still hadn't charged my phone. What was I thinking? Finding the diner I had passed before, the setup was one of those tube-like buildings that used to populate the country, slowly disappearing one by one to make way for franchises. Hello, I left my bike in the parking lot. The rain started to pick up, nothing hard yet, but it was coming soon. Again, I began to wonder why I would even ask. At this point, I'm just going to let myself in. I found a place for my phone to charge. The outlet looked a little weird, but it fit. When the screen came on, I could have guessed as much, no signal. Looking around the empty diner with its colorful booths, counter cakes in the displays, the grill in the back, even a jukebox and cigarette dispenser, I walked up, placing a few loose quarters in both. I found myself putting "Jingle, Jingle, Jingle" on the jukebox, a cigarette hanging out of my mouth. I checked the back room, the grills all worked and even the ovens. Playing with the switches, I found myself even dancing to antiquated songs, singing with a sparse knowledge of the lyrics. There was a fridge full of vegetables, red meat, even a steak. Putting the steak on, I heard "The End of the World" by Skeeter Davis starting to play. The eerie song almost put the sound of complete silence in perspective. I'm a cemetery operations coordinator, or you can just call me a cemetery manager. Part of my job is sitting down with guests and family members of the deceased to set up funerals, facilitate the sales of plots. A 30-something-year-old man named Claude, a very spiritual man, once sat down with me to purchase a plot for his sick father who was in hospice care. Claude was a Hispanic man with a very thick accent, and I saw in his eyes he was a very caring man. He showed me pictures of his father, who also looked like a very sweet man, much too young to be taken away from his family. Unfortunately, the man's time came that same week, and Claude arranged for his father's funeral service at the cemetery. It was a very stormy day, the day of the funeral, which is thought to be a sign of good luck. The funeral procession stopped in front of the front office building briefly. I stepped outside under the front awning of the building and saw Claude in the car behind the hearse. We waved at each other. Due to the weather, I went back inside until the procession was ready to proceed to the burial site. I got in one of the cemetery pickup trucks and followed the procession to the final stop where I would stand with my umbrella, supervising, as part of my job is making sure funeral services go smoothly. After the funeral, I did some laps around the place in the truck just to survey the area, as I did at least a couple times a day. I had a lot of paperwork to take care of, and on top of this, I had to close the cemetery that night. So, a little later, I went back to my desk and took care of this. The cemetery closes at 5:30, so as soon as it started to get dark, I drove around the place one more time to ensure all visitors had left, then drove over to the front gate to shut it. It was a relatively warm early March. The days were still on the shorter side, so by closing time on a normal day, it would already be getting darker, but on this stormy day, it already felt like it was nighttime. I was driving back to my office when I thought I saw someone hurriedly walking down one of the lanes of tombstones before turning behind a hedge and disappearing out of sight. I beeped my horn to let them know the place was closed, but strangely enough, I didn't see them again. I grabbed my umbrella and ran out into the rain in that direction. I turned beyond the hedge they turned at and looked down this long row of tombstones on one side and hedges on the other. I didn't see anyone. I looked around in the rain for a solid 20 minutes, but eventually, I had to give up. I drove back up to the office and browsed through the CCTV footage. None of it picked up any unusual movement, even though it was a bit harder to see much because of the storm, and it was also pitch black outside now. I tried to multitask, keeping an eye on the camera while finishing up some of my paperwork, when I heard the front door to the visitation room slammed shut. I sprang up from my chair and yelled, "Hello." My first thought was that it was the same person I saw before. Maybe they got locked in the cemetery and were looking for assistance in leaving. I stepped out into the lobby, but no one was there. I looked around and again said, "Hello." Maybe the door slamming shut was them leaving. I started looking out all the windows, and I stopped when, through one of them, I saw someone on the other side looking back at me with a blank expression. I jumped back and screamed, and they didn't flinch. I stepped closer and made a squinty-eyed, confused look when I realized I recognized this Hispanic, older-looking man. In my head, it reminded me exactly of the pictures of Claude's father he showed me. With my heart in my throat, I ran out the front door of the building and to the side where I saw the man, but he was gone. He wasn't booking it into the fields. He wasn't hiding in a bush nearby. He was gone. I looked around me as I stood in the rain getting soaked, then ran back inside, packed up my things, locked up, and got in my car. I opened and closed the gate once more, locking it behind me, and drove home. When my wife asked me at home why I was being so quiet, I just told her it was a long day at work. To this day, I think I was just overworking myself, and my mind was playing tricks on me, but it still is genuinely disturbing to think about. My name is Craig. This was in the dead of October, chilly and windy. I live in a somewhat big town. It's very poor and old, with early 18th century type buildings. A friend and I were bored one night and decided to go around at 3 a.m. I know that going out at 3 a.m. in a poor town isn't exactly smart, but we like to have our fun. We got bored of driving around blasting our music. We're both very big metal heads, and at that point, we had our own band, so we decided it would be interesting and cool to walk around a cemetery in the town behind the old town square. There's a massive cemetery. It's divided by two sides of a highway, both sides taking up about 20 acres of land. As I said, it's massive. We decided to check out the older part of the cemetery. This part is completely separated from the rest of the newer cemetery with an old iron fence and gate. We got to walking around and checking out the cemetery, trying to read the old moss-covered graves, taking pictures, being a little bit disrespectful, I know, but these were graves from at least a century ago, so there was no one living that would be upset by it, and I'm sure the people in the graves didn't mind too much. After about an hour of checking it out, we sat down next to a giant pecan tree in the middle of the old cemetery. That's when we heard this little girl laughing. It was really close to us. At first, I assumed maybe it was a toy left on a child's grave or something like that. I'm not one to scare easily, so I just figured it's motion activated or something like that. We are not at all easy to scare, so we both sort of laughed, pointing out that it's creepy, and just kept talking and enjoying the ambience. Then, as in all stories like this, I got the feeling of something or someone watching me. Once again, I just figured that I was letting the entire thing get into my head. Then my friend says he thinks he sees someone in the shadows of a small wooded area right next to the cemetery, of which we were really close at this point. We're both a little creeped out and decided to get up and leave. And that noise, the exact same noise, played again. When we heard leaves crunching underneath the feet of someone, that's when we booked it. We ran down the hill leading to the old part of the cemetery, down to where my car was parked. I've never run that fast in my life. It sounded like that laughing noise was following us. At that point, we both sort of just went into full fight or flight mode, going as fast as we could without thinking. The noises behind us stopped as we got to my car. I started my car and put it in drive, pulling out into the highway without looking. Luckily, no one hit us. We got down the road to the only gas station that's open at this time of night to check in the back of my car. We had both been discussing how we were scared some had been done to it. We got around to check and immediately found the back doors open. I know for a fact neither of us ever opened it. There was no reason for us to open it. I looked in the back seats to make sure nothing was there, got right back in the car, and peeled out. I'm still confused about what happened that night. I'm not sure if we both overreacted or what. All I know is that I still feel that weird feeling that something is behind you whenever I tell this story. When I was 18, my friend Dash, who was a big goofball, came over to chill in our basement as he often would during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand, and I was eating Wendy's when he said we should check out that creepy little cemetery across town. It was the most random idea ever, and I even told him that. Still, we had no school the next day, and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if one should even call it a regular cemetery. It's just a small plot of land with maybe 100 tombstones at most. The tombstones were very archaic looking, and any time we'd pass, there would be no signs of anyone having come to visit within the last decade. The site probably dated back centuries and had this super creepy vibe to it because it was closed off by a Gothic metal fence and surrounded by woods on two sides, the road on one, and some old abandoned building on the other. Everything about it just gave scary vibes. It took a little persuading, but Dash managed to get me to want to check it out too. Ironically, it was a very cloudy, reddish kind of day, conveniently adding to the mood. Dash pulled up his Honda to the side of the road. I told him to pull up more so it wasn't obvious. This was a low-traffic road, so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few hundred feet down the road, and we got out and cut through the woods so that any potential passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the little cemetery. Hopping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Dash kind of took the lead on this since it was mainly his venture. He led us through the eerie little plot of land, and we looked at the archaic tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century. The writing on some of them was illegible at that point. I know it sounds super dumb and cliché, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched constantly. I started looking around the surrounding woods. I told Dash how creepy this was. "I know," he replied. Still with the feeling of being watched, I looked at the abandoned building next to the cemetery, at one of the windows. For a brief moment, I knew I saw someone standing at the window, even through the fog, smudge, and dirt on the glass. But they casually either ducked or walked away from the window. I told Dash we were being watched by someone in that building, and he turned to look at it as well. Then he went to look for the entrance to it. I told him, "Don't." I said we should just leave before we get in trouble. I stayed still by the tombstone he was looking at while he walked around a building, and then he found a way in. He called me over, but I stayed put. I heard some loud kind of crack, so I looked in that direction, and there was this older man, probably around 55. Gray hair, had on a black raincoat, I believe he was wearing jeans, and he had a mustache, but that's all I really got of him. Then he opened his mouth and screamed. Not just yelled, he screamed, "Get out!" He screamed it so loud I thought I saw birds fly away from being startled. Just like that, I started to feel lightheaded, and suddenly everything went dark. The next thing I remember was waking up to being dragged in the woods. I freaked out, thinking I was being kidnapped, but when I turned and got up, I saw it was just Dash. Dash was freaking out about something. He told me to follow him and run back to the car, so I didn't ask questions. As we ran through the woods, I heard something close behind me, and when I turned, I realized we were being followed by someone. So I ran even faster. We got to his Honda, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. When Dash was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of freaky dolls with buttons for eyes. He didn't get to see anything else in the building because he heard the old man scream at me outside. He came running to find me passed out on the floor, and he saw the old man slowly walking over to me. He started to drag me away from the old man and into the woods. He actually literally picked me up and threw me over the fence to get me out. I quickly came back to consciousness, and that's when we ran. I had only fainted one time in my life, and it was at that moment. I don't know why I fainted, but it happening at a graveyard with some kind of satanic ritual building right next to it makes it that much stranger. My grandpa passed away a few years ago. I was always very close with him. This past August, on his birthday, I paid him a visit at the cemetery. The cemetery he and my grandma chose to be buried at was about an hour drive from my apartment. My family lived closer, so they all went to his grave together. I had to go separately. It was a rainy, depressing day, and there's nothing worse than visiting a cemetery on a gloomy day. The gatekeeper of the gate asked for the plot number. I gave it to him, and he let me in. It's a pretty big cemetery, and I'd only been there a couple of other times, not as the driver though, so I had a hard time finding it. I didn't see many other people, if any, at the cemetery that day. I'm sure the weather had something to do with it. Eventually, I found his stone and parked my car in the grass to the side. I put some flowers down under a stone, stood there for a while with my eyes closed, and prayed. When I finished my prayer, I opened my eyes and looked up. There was an old man standing about 5 rows of graves down directly across from me, and he was looking right at me. I knew this man, though. It was my grandfather. No, it couldn't be. I rubbed my eyes, and he was gone. Did I just have a spiritual moment, or were my eyes and mind playing tricks on me? Either way, I got the chills, and I had goosebumps. I was quite honestly freaked out. I got back in my car, said, "Love you, Grandpa," and drove off. I felt like I had a headache on my way home, not sure why. I was the only car on Prospect Road, a quiet road with dense forest on either side. Commonly, there would be deer crossing here. My car zipped down the road. I spotted someone on the side of the road coming up, which was odd because there were no sidewalks or a walking path on this road. I slowed down. It couldn't be. It looked like my grandpa again. When I realized this, my heart dropped 1,000 feet, and I swerved the car accidentally. I desperately tried to regain control and come to a stop. Luckily, my car didn't end up in a tree, rather, it just skidded out in the middle of the road until coming to a halt. I immediately looked back to where I saw him and saw a deer on the side of the road looking at my car. My heart was literally racing. I was terrified and not well, and I needed to get home. I made sure no cars were coming and got back in my lane. I focused on the road as best I could, given what I had just seen twice. I felt weird the rest of the day, not sick, but something wasn't right with my head. I went to bed early after watching an episode of my show. I woke up at like 3 in the morning to my phone ringing. It was an unknown number. My heart started racing again. Any call at this hour couldn't be good news. I accepted the call and put the phone up to my ear. It was static on the other end. Finally, I said, "Hello." More static, but what I thought I heard next, I couldn't believe. Just briefly, for maybe half a second, I thought I heard my grandpa's voice over the static. I tried to say hello again, but I was too shook. Every part of my body was actually shaking. Then the call cut to silence and ended. I called my phone provider the next day to trace the number. They couldn't. They didn't have enough data to trace it apparently, though I don't know if that was just or not. The events that took place that day and night were the scariest I've ever experienced. Do I think my dead grandpa was trying to contact me? I don't know, because that sounds ridiculous. You think if you experience something like this, you'd be so full of emotion and joy, but no. It still terrifies me, and I really still don't know what to think or how to feel about it. Whether it sounds ridiculous or not, this happened, and I wonder almost every other night, was that really my grandpa on the phone? My friends and I were very stupid when we were teenagers. I was like 16 or 17 when this happened. It was the month of October, and I wanted to do something scary in the spirit of Halloween. There's a small cemetery about 15 minutes from where I live, and when I was drunk with a couple of friends, I said we should sneak into it. I'll make up some names for my friends, Dion and Ezra. We were at Dion's house. He didn't drink ever, so when I came up with the idea, he was the one to drive us to the cemetery. Ezra and I were really the ones leading this. Dion was just along for the ride. But then again, he hadn't been drinking. Dion parked in some parking lot across the street. It was a ghost town because it was past midnight at that point. We made sure no one was around to see us as we hopped the fence into the cemetery. It wasn't exactly pitch black out, but it was slightly hard to see more than 10 feet in front of us, so we were all using our iPhone flashlights. There didn't appear to be any night security in the cemetery, so we kind of dispersed from each other. Dion seemed to be following Ezra more closely. I could still see where they were because of their flashlights. I went off a little further on my own and decided I'd start taking a creepy video. So I started recording with the lights still on, of course. I recorded a bunch of old headstones and the general eerie vibe of the cemetery at night. I didn't see Ezra and Dion anymore, so I started to go look for them, still recording. I looked at my phone screen and froze. There was a woman dressed in a white gown or a dress, I want to say, with long gray-looking hair. She was looking down at the ground. I looked up from my phone screen to look at her in person, but she was gone. I started to back away. I looked back at my phone screen, and there she was again, only now she was looking into the camera, or rather looking at me. I looked up from the phone again and could not see her once more, so I looked back down at the screen again, and there I could see her moving closer to me. I started to scream for Ezra and Dion as I sprinted away from that spot. I couldn't see their lights anywhere. They weren't answering my screams. I had a feeling they were going to try to scare me, so I ran back for the fence of the cemetery to hop it and get out. I made it to Dion's car and texted the two of them, saying they need to get out of the cemetery now. They met me at the car minutes later. We all sat in a car, and I showed them the video I took. They had the same horrified looks on their faces I did. Now that I was actually watching the whole video, I could see the moment the woman slowly lifted her head from looking at the ground to looking at me, and then she starts to move towards me. We could only see her moving for like a second or two before I start screaming in the video and running away. But the way she was moving, we could see no leg movement. It almost seemed as though she were floating to me. I had that video saved on my old iPhone 5S, but the stupid thing won't turn on. It gets stuck at the Apple logo. I don't want to reset that phone until I can get that video off of it somehow. My friends firmly believe the woman in the video was a real living person who also happened to be in the cemetery that night, but me, having been the one to actually find her and only being able to see her on my phone screen, well, let's just say I was never a believer in the paranormal until that night. Foreign off this chick that was a little unstable to say the least. She'd probably kill me if she heard what I was about to say using her real name, so for my own sake, I'm going to refer to her as Jane. To make a long backstory short, she came from a messed up family, and her dad was sort of at the center of a lot of her problems. When he finally died, she told me she went to the funeral just so she could find out where he was buried. A few days later, in the middle of the night, Jane called to ask me to take her to the cemetery to smash his gravestone. Although that was something I would never do to anyone, no matter how much I hated them, I could understand why Jane would want to do something like that against her father's memory. She didn't have a license, so I picked her up and we drove to the cemetery. When I parked the car in the visitor lot outside, she pulled a hammer and a handful of grocery bags out of her purse. She said she just wanted to go in, smash it up into a bunch of small pieces, bag it up, and leave. Obviously, I knew that we were breaking at least one law by trespassing into the cemetery after dark, but this was all right with me. I just told her I would keep an eye out for anyone in the area while she did what she needed to do. On that note, we got out and hurried over to the grave. Jane knew exactly where it was, so it took us no time at all, but I was still extremely nervous about the whole thing. It wasn't just the threat of being arrested, but the vibe of the cemetery itself. I really felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, like we were disturbing all those dead people by marching through in the middle of the night. I kept my hat on straight and tried to give Jane space. At first, she spent a minute kneeling on top of the relatively fresh grave, whispering a bunch of curses and crying just from the sheer intensity of whatever emotion she was feeling. But then, without warning, she started screaming and striking the headstone. The first time caught me so off guard that it sent chills through my whole body. I spun around and was about to tell her to quiet down, but at first glance, I knew she wasn't going to hear me. She was going absolutely berserk on this stone, screaming and wailing at the top of her lungs. Each time she hit it with the hammer, only a small piece would break off. I realized we were going to be there for a while if it went on at this pace, and she was making so much god-awful noise I was terrified that somebody in the nearby neighborhood would hear us. I also thought about how blood-curdling it would feel to be walking by the graveyard and hear Jane's banshee-like shrieking in the distance, and to be unsure if she was like a ghost or a serial killer or something. My instincts set in and I became more concerned about my own safety than anything else. Here was this completely unhinged, crazy person violently thrashing her way through a mixture of grief and unhealed trauma, seeing red with total tunnel vision, and I was alone with her, surrounded by darkness and dead people. I was worried that if I got near her, she would forget it was me and think I was the ghost of her father and start trying to kill me or something, so I backed away. However, it wasn't long before the deep-seated rage within Jane started to wear off a bit and she became tired. She then stopped and looked at the progress she had made. 2/3 of the headstone was still intact, but she was already exhausted. That's when she looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw the look of unveiled insanity in Jane's eyes. I'd always known Jane had a few screws loose, but this was next-level crazy. All her movements were sudden and jarring. She stood and shoved the hammer into my chest, telling me to take it and finish the job. I protested at first, not wanting to get roped further into what I thought was Jane's thing she needed to do, but as soon as I did, she grabbed me by the ears and yanked my head down so that my face was less than an inch away from hers. She then screamed so loud that it practically ruptured my eardrums. She demanded that I break the gravestone for her, or she'd use the hammer on me and bury my body next to her father's. Seeing that I was in too deep to back out, I reluctantly accepted the task and committed myself to making short work of it. Of course, I was stronger than Jane, but I wasn't nearly as uninhibited. What happened next, though, made me all the more sure that I shouldn't have tried to fight her or anything. As I was hacking away at the stone, managing to break off bigger pieces, she was standing behind me laughing like an absolute maniac. She was cheering me on the way I imagine a witch would encourage another witch to their first human sacrifice. I tried my best to ignore her, but it was impossible. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that she had pulled out a knife, which sent another chill down my spine. Before I knew it, she knelt behind me and straddled my back, throwing her arms over my shoulders, whispering little pure evil into my ears. I froze up and stopped swinging the hammer because I didn't want to hit her. She told me I was almost done. Then she did something I'll never forget. Both of her hands were out in front of me, one of which held the knife right before my eyes. She put the blade to her palm and sliced it open, creating a fountain of blood which quickly spilled down her wrist. Then she whispered some kind of satanic blessing in tongues and smeared her bloody hand over my face, from my forehead down to my chin, then across my throat until she finally rested her hand with a vice grip at the base of my neck. She asked me if I could taste the blood, and I said I could. She took pleasure in this, and then she finally let go of me to stand on the grave again. Then she screamed out at the top of her lungs that these would be the final tears she would ever cry over her father. As she looked up into the night sky with her eyes open, she put her hand up to the moon and clenched her fist, squeezing the wound to form drops of blood which fell down upon her eyes and face. I watched this whole thing, stunned out of my mind, until she looked back at me with her face full of bloody tears and growled at me to finish the job. Of course, I was thoroughly terrified of Jane by this point and I was ready to leave. I just did as she said. At last, when the whole thing was smashed to bits, I convinced Jane that we needed to go. Thankfully, she seemed ready, but the entire time we were picking up the pieces and bagging them, she was giggling. When it was all cleaned up, we ran back to my car, somehow going through this whole entire ordeal without anyone seeing us or calling the cops on us. I drove Jane back home and I dropped her off. As she got out of my car, she tried to drag me out to spend the night with her. I'd been waiting for that night for months, but by then I knew where that would go. I knew it would be no good for me, so I made up some excuse about having to work the next day in the morning. I cut off all contact and I've been avoiding her out of fear ever since. I'll never forget when I worked nighttime security at a cemetery for about 2 weeks. It was never something I wanted to do as a security guard, but I didn't have a choice. The agency I worked for forced me to transfer due to an incident where I allegedly assaulted a kid who happened to have rich parents while doing my job. I'm not allowed to talk about that case, though, so I won't. I didn't want to work at a cemetery for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, my boss told me to accept the transfer or resign from the agency, and I wasn't ready to be out of a job. The cemetery in question was the oldest in the city, and it was considered historic. However, it had just signed a contract for nighttime security after a couple of grave robberies that had recently occurred. It only happened twice in recent history, but in the span of a couple of weeks, which indicated that it might happen again. Aside from the daytime toll with workers, I was the first security guard to work there, which meant I had nobody before me to tell me how things might go. I couldn't instill the first night, so I made a lot of walkabouts to the burial grounds in an effort to desensitize myself from how damn spooky it was in the dark. It had the opposite effect, though. At one point, I came across one of the graves that had been robbed. It was already refilled, although the grass hadn't been recovered yet. The marker was eroded, but I could tell that it was a woman who had lived to be pretty old. I paid my respects and I walked on without thinking much of it. Over the course of a few nights, nothing happened. It was one of the more boring starts to a job that I've had. I was used to getting off work around 4 or 5 a.m. at the latest, but I was in the graveyard from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., 3 nights a week, and that schedule didn't suit me. I became extremely drowsy halfway through each shift, and the coffee available in the booth was like water to me. When I went back for my second round of shifts, I was already over it. There was nobody around to notice, though, so I didn't care. I was through with my first week, so I figured my supervisors would be more relaxed about watching over the camera footage. Instead of trying to force myself to stay awake when I was exhausted and nothing was happening, I let myself sleep when I felt like it. I didn't think the grave robbers would actually come back and try their luck for a third time once they knew I was there, and it's not like I had a problem stealing company time from the agency that screwed me over. However, there was one party who had a problem with me sleeping on the job. The last night I worked there, I was exhausted from the previous shifts and it didn't take too long for me to start dozing off in my chair. I actually fell into a deep enough sleep to start dreaming. I don't remember how the dream started, but I know that at some point it suddenly became a nightmare. I'd laid down thinking I was about to get a massage or something, only to feel immense pain in my stomach. I screamed and opened my eyes to see an elderly woman standing above me with a shovel, plunging it into my abdomen and digging out my insides. I couldn't move, and all I could do was watch her eviscerate me. It was the most vivid dream that I've ever had. Luckily, I was able to force myself awake. I opened my eyes with a start. Then, right there on the other side of the booth window, I saw that same decrepit old woman staring right at me. I jumped back and fell off the chair, losing sight of her for a second. When I got to my feet, she was gone, but I was thoroughly shaken. I was terrified by the thought of going out there, but I knew it was my job to go looking for anyone who attempted to trespass. To be honest, I didn't feel any safer being a sitting duck in the toll booth. I stepped outside into the cold under a full moon and turned on my flashlight, throwing the beam in every direction. At first, I didn't see anyone, but then my heart skipped a beat when I saw a figure standing near the back of the property by the trees. I shouted at them, but they didn't respond. I had to look away for a second as I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, but it was thankfully just a possum that I startled into running off. That was logical and reassuring, although there was still that mysterious figure standing by the woods. But, of course, when I looked back, she was gone. I couldn't understand how such a frail old woman was covering so much ground, but I marched over to where I last saw her without thinking about it. I had to walk across the entire graveyard to get to the back of the property. Along the way, it seemed like every single creature in the woods was going insane. I heard flocks of birds suddenly take flight from all the trees at once. An owl let out one of those awful screeches that they make. Even a pack of coyotes started to go haywire in the distance. I felt like all the forces in nature were warning me not to keep going, but in my gut, I was worried that if I stopped walking, something else would happen. So I pressed on until I finally got to the edge of the graveyard. I looked around with a flashlight and called out to the person I saw, but I didn't see or hear anyone. Then, as quickly as it all had started, all the noises in the woods stopped. Every single animal fell silent, even the bugs went quiet. I muttered to myself in confusion and started to turn around. But that's when I noticed I was standing right on top of one of the graves that had been robbed, the one of the old woman that I'd seen the week before. As soon as I realized this, I felt stiff hands wrap around my throat and my feet were kicked out from under me. I couldn't see who was doing this to me, but they were strong as hell. They bashed my face into the recently replaced dirt probably a dozen times until it started to feel like I was about to pass out from lack of oxygen. Then, at the last second, it stopped. I felt the rough touch of the hand simply disappear. I quickly got to my feet in a panic, but I couldn't see anyone in the area. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing, but there was no way that I could have. It felt as real as anything else. Whatever it was had me chilled to the bone. I didn't finish my shift that night. I ran to my car with my tail between my legs and quit the job on the spot. This event has haunted me ever since. I've pieced together what it meant over the years. The spirit of the old woman who was robbed didn't take kindly to me slacking on the job, and she took matters into her own hands to make sure it never happened again. I've never been a superstitious person, but sometimes things happen in life that make you reevaluate your assumptions. Even now, when I'm at work and I feel myself getting the urge to slack off, I see that woman out of the corner of my eye for a split second, reminding me of the lesson she taught me. I've never told this story to anyone. I know I shouldn't even do so anonymously at the risk of being connected to it, but it's been eating at me for decades. It happened when I was a kid. I was about 13 years old, and it was the night of Halloween. I lived in a relatively new suburb at the time, which had been built to increase the number of homes in the small town that was growing adjacent to the freeway. It all looks very different now, but back then the area wasn't nearly as developed. Strangely, nowhere was this more obvious than the cemetery that was a few turns off the main road in what used to be the outskirts. At the time, it was mostly vacant. Not enough people had died to fill it up yet. That would change, however, as me and my two friends, who I'll protect by calling Aaron and Michael, decided we wanted to go exploring the empty graveyard instead of trick-or-treating. We knew it would get us in trouble, so we put in some effort to cover our tracks. We wore costumes and started the night by immediately stealing a few bowls of candy that were set out and mixed them all together so it would look as though we actually went trick-or-treating like our parents thought. Then we walked about a mile off the beaten path so we could get to the cemetery without being seen by the cars on the main road. This involved hopping a fence that surrounded a large drainage pond for the freeway and cutting across the banks to hop the fence again into the cemetery grounds. As we got off the residential streets, we were bathed in darkness, which meant there was almost no chance that we would be seen. We thought we were safe, but what we didn't know was that we were being followed. Once we had successfully snuck in, we stomped around and tried to scare each other for laughs. Then we found a few blank gravestones laying around next to a crypt, and we smashed them together just because we could. We took a few chunks as souvenirs. There wasn't much else for us to get up to, though. The whole place was eerily empty. We were used to seeing them filled to the brim with gravestones, but the majority of this space was just uninterrupted grass. Eventually, we got bored, but we weren't ready to leave, so we sat down against the backs of a few gravestones to avoid sitting on top of dead people. There was a view of the freeway that looked pretty cool since it was the only thing that was lit up for miles. For a moment, we were just sitting there being kids. Then it all came crashing down as we heard what sounded like a person behind us. We all jumped in fright and we turned around. We couldn't see anything, just gravestones. The ghastly wailing continued, and then it started to say our names. We shouted at it, trying to claim we weren't scared of it, but we were. We thought we were totally alone, so maybe it was a ghost that was mad at us for being there when we weren't supposed to be. We started walking towards it with small, terrified steps, hoping we would look behind one of the gravestones and see a person messing with us. All three of us were clutching broken chunks of granite as if it would help defend us from the supernatural. When we started getting closer, it seemed like we were localizing the source of the noise. That's when it said something that I wished it wouldn't every single day. For context, my friend Aaron's mother was extremely ill with cancer at the time. That's part of the reason that we were acting out by breaking into the cemetery in the first place. He was in a funk, and he was mad at the world, and he was our friend that we did stuff with. Understandably, Aaron stopped in his tracks when the voice claimed that it was the ghost of his mother. I can't imagine what was going on through his head, a lot of powerful mixed emotions that must have been a lot for a 13-year-old to handle. He shouted back, trying to cast it out, but he was already choking up. The supposed ghost of his mother dug deeper, saying that she just died a few minutes ago. Aaron said that was a lie, but the voice didn't care. It started to cry and say that because he wasn't in the neighborhood like a good boy, his father wasn't able to find him, and she died wondering where her son was and why he didn't love her enough to be there. Aaron yelled again that it wasn't true, that it couldn't be, but it struck him so badly he was failing to hold back his tears. Michael and I started trying our best to console him, not really knowing how. But then the mood changed on a dime when the unknown voice stopped crying and started laughing. Then it didn't sound like the ghost of a woman anymore, but a snickering boy. We looked over and saw someone crawling out of their hiding spot behind a gravestone. It was somebody we knew, but I can't say his name. He was a couple of years older than us, and he was a neighborhood bully. He must have seen us sneaking off and followed us so he could pull some kind of prank like this for kicks. All of Aaron's sadness turned into anger in an instant as he charged toward the bully, who was laughing so hard he didn't notice how pissed off Aaron was. Nobody expected him to do what he did next. Aaron tackled the boy to the ground and started beating on him, screaming furiously that it was way too far to joke about someone's sick mother dying. Michael and I agreed, and we hated being bullied by this kid too, so we let it happen, figuring it would teach the jerk a lesson. Unfortunately, we didn't notice before it was too late that Aaron wasn't just pounding the kid in the face with his fists, but with the chunk of gravestone he'd broken off a few minutes prior. After just a few more seconds, there was no sound or movement from the bully, no indication at all that he was still fighting back. Michael and I exchanged a worried look right before deciding that this, in fact, was going too far and we needed to stop it. We rushed over to Aaron and pulled him off the bully. As we held him back, we looked down at the other kid and saw just how badly he'd been beaten. The jagged stone had turned his face into an unrecognizable bloody mess. There were deep gashes all over his face and head. Even in the darkness, we knew. But we still waited for him to get up or to at least groan in pain. But he never did. Gradually, Aaron let go of his rage and he came to realize what he'd done. Michael and I were already stunned. He broke away from us, but then he rushed back into panic, trying to wake the kid up by shaking and yelling his name. But none of it was any good. He finally looked back at us and he asked us to say that he was just unconscious and not dead. Only one of us knew how to check. I could see that Michael was shaking as he stepped to the body and knelt down, checking for a pulse. He checked and waited, even bringing his ear down to his face to check for breathing. But unfortunately, he only confirmed the worst. Aaron had killed our neighborhood bully. After an internal silence, Aaron snapped us out of our daze. He took charge of the moment. He led us through the cover-up. We all thought about just coming clean, but we were so afraid of the repercussions. Well, Aaron was, and there was a small sick part of us that was glad that it happened, to be honest. The bully got what he deserved, to a certain extent. We did our best to think so anyways. Besides, we had no idea how to act in a situation like that, so we just listened to the orders that we heard. We dragged the body to the fence around the drainage pond and ripped the bottom of the chain-link fence out of the dirt so we could pull the body under to the other side. Then we got a gravestone and a bunch of broken chunks and threw them over, including the ones we thought were going to be souvenirs for the night. We took off his shoes and his jeans, then slid a gravestone underneath his shirt, fastening it to his chest by tying his jeans around his torso. Then we tied his shoes to his ankles and filled them with stones. Aaron then dragged the body into the pond, and he was holding it up until he was neck deep. Then he pushed it towards the center and let go. We watched it sink as Aaron turned around and came out of the water looking like a completely different person. Aaron's clothes needed to dry at least a little bit so we didn't look obviously drenched before we went back to the neighborhood, and we needed to make sure that the body wouldn't immediately float to the surface. So after throwing everything related to the killing in the pond and washing our hands of the blood, we hopped the fence and sat on the banks for a while where we couldn't be seen. It was totally silent the entire time. The bloodstains had been rinsed out of his clothes, but we would never be able to look at Aaron without seeing them. It was on our hands now too, and we had to live with that. It was hard to pretend to be a normal kid after that twisted coming-of-age moment. The disappearance was the talk of the town for days, even weeks, until the body finally floated to the surface a few weeks later and the murder was discovered. Nobody ever suspected us, but the publicity of the case going unsolved was torturous for us all, and the worst for Aaron. Michael and I were able to get back to a semblance of normal after a couple of years, but Aaron was never the same. When his mother finally died, he never talked to us again, and he never made any other friends. He kind of became the town degenerate, and nobody but Michael and I knew the real reason why. When he was 17, he ran away from home, and he's never been seen or heard from since. In my mid-30s, about 10 years ago, I worked as security personnel at a cemetery. It was located in a not-so-great part of the city, so having someone on site 24/7 was necessary. Even then, we'd still get people sneaking in and spraying graffiti on the stones or even trying to dig up graves. Most of these stunts happened at night, which was good for me because I always worked the evening shift, usually from 2 to 10. Granted, I'd still have to be there alone for a couple of hours into the night, between 8 and 10, but it was still much better than the alternative graveyard shift. On this day, I was warned about some people coming by the cemetery at random hours and just sort of stalking the place. It had been going on for a few days, and the other workers weren't sure who they were or what they were doing. I said I'd keep an eye out. By 6 o'clock, the other workers had left, and it was just me. This was always my favorite half of my shift because I wouldn't have to worry about looking like I was busy the whole time. If we're being real, there wasn't ever much point to me being there when the other workers were around too anyway. If you don't already know, The job is made up mostly of riding around in a golf cart and making sure nothing is going on. From 6 to 8, I drove around and picked up a few pieces of trash left in the yard. There were a few more visitors that came, and at 8:30, I waited for the last people to leave. Then I went to lock up the front gate. While wrapping the chain around the bars and putting the lock on, I noticed a group of people on the other side of the road. They were facing my direction like they were watching me. I finished securing the gate, then got back in my cart and drove off. I knew that it was likely the group I was told to keep an eye out for, so I parked the cart in a spot where I could still see them. There were 3 people from what I could see. They stayed in the same spot for a couple of minutes before walking away. I drove around, making sure they weren't trying to find a way in on the sides, but I didn't see them. Around 9 o'clock, I parked by the front gate again for a few minutes when I heard a sharp sound echo through the field. I whipped my head around in the direction it came from, but it was too dark to see. I started the cart back up and made my way through the field. The sound was so echoey and loud that I couldn't tell if it was from inside the cemetery or from just outside of it. As I drove through, I started to see some figures in the distance, only 2 figures though, not the 3 I'd seen earlier. As I pulled closer, they noticed me, turning their bodies to face me but not running. I stopped the cart maybe 15 feet away and got out. The place closes at 8:30. "You gotta go," I called out. I took a few steps forward. "Do I really have to call the cops?" I said, getting more irritated and slightly more nervous. That's when I noticed one of them was holding something. It was a shovel, but they weren't really standing close to any gravestones. I looked down at the ground next to them, and there was a clear spot they'd been digging in. Then out of nowhere, I heard a guy behind me yell. The 2 started running, and the one behind me ran in a different direction. I got in the cart and turned it on to try and chase the one guy, but right away, I could feel that something was wrong with the cart. It was shaking and wobbling when I tried to drive it. I got out, and it was clear that the 2 left tires had been slashed. I frantically called the police and ran to the main building. Thankfully, the group didn't seem interested in chasing me, but seeing as they had likely slashed the tires with a knife and that there were 3 of them, I was terrified. When the police arrived, the group was long gone, but we did find the half-dugout hole they made. We were really confused by it until we found something else along the fence not far from the hole they were digging. We found a body bag. Yes, unfortunately, there was a body in it. After some days went by, it came out that the man in the bag was part of some gang and must have been killed in a shooting. What we think is that the group was trying to dispose of the body discreetly and thought that if they dug a grave and buried him in a cemetery, then it would blend in and nobody would find it. I can't say it was a terrible plan, but the execution of it wasn't the best. Although none of the men in the group were ever found or identified. I work at a cemetery on the edge of my town. It's a small one, being only a few acres of land. I'd been working there for a year at the time, and I hated every minute of it. Not really because it was a cemetery, but just because it was boring. I was alone all night and sat in a small room for most of the time. There were 2 cameras set up on either side of the yard and one on the entrance of the tiny building I was in. My boss always told me that my job was to just be there, and if anything actually happens, then to call the police and let them take care of it. In the whole year before this, not a single thing happened. Again, it was a small cemetery in a small town, so not a lot of action was expected. On a Monday evening, I pulled into the parking lot and relieved my coworker from his day shift. I hadn't slept the best that day, so I brought a cup of coffee to help keep me up. For the first hour, I was sipping on my coffee and watching the cameras while also scrolling through my phone a bit. Come 1 a.m., I started to get really drowsy. I was nodding off in my chair, and the coffee wasn't really helping either. In the middle of the hour, I guess I fully fell asleep. What I think was 20 or so minutes later, I woke up to an odd sound, metal creaking behind me. I swiveled around in my chair. The door to my building was cracked open, swaying slightly from the wind outside. My heart hurt from the strike of fear it gave me. I got up and pulled the door further open, peeking my head outside and looking around. Nobody was in sight. I slammed the door firmly shut and made sure it was fully locked. It could have been a simple mistake, not fully closing the door, but it got my hair standing up. I rolled back the footage outside the building and didn't see anyone coming up to the building. At least after this, I was wide awake. I was constantly checking each camera. About 10 minutes later, I saw something move on the screen. It was the camera on the far end of the yard. Someone was walking through the cemetery. I watched as they slowly made their way past several gravestones, then stopped. I waited a few seconds before picking up the phone and dialing 911, still keeping my eyes on the screen. I spoke softly into the phone, telling the operator that I worked at the cemetery and there was a man trespassing. The woman on the phone started responding when suddenly the man sprinted through the yard and off of the screen. I let out an uncontrollable gasp, moving my eyes all around the other cameras looking for him. A second later, he appeared on the other screen, sprinting past it again, and not long after, he appeared on the screen showing the outside of the building I was in. I told the woman what was going on, that I needed to be quiet. I put the phone down and stared at the camera. It was a man who was now standing right outside the door. Then he looked around at the face of the building before locking his eyes on the camera. It made me shiver, seeing him stare at the camera as if he could see me through the screen. "Hello. Can you help me?" I heard his muffled voice from the other side of the door. Then, without even waiting for an answer, he walked around to the back of the building. There were no cameras on that side, but I could hear his footsteps in the grass. He sounded like he was walking right up against the wall. Then out of nowhere, I heard his footsteps departing quickly. My heart was racing all the way up until the police came. I thought I'd sound crazy, but they found very defined shoe prints in the grass. They followed them far off, way past the cemetery border, but lost the trail before it led anywhere else. The man's behavior was very odd, and the way he asked for help was even odder. I don't know if the door being opened earlier was somehow him, but I don't know what to believe anymore. Despite being scared shitless, I continued working and still worked there. Nothing else has happened, and the man never returned, but I don't think I'll ever fall asleep at the cemetery again. Thank you. My friends and I were never the smartest group. We did some really stupid stunts like going to abandoned areas, vacant homes, etc. But the worst of all the things we did was when we went to the cemetery one night. Every other thing we did, nothing ever happened, but this time was different. We were sophomores in high school, and it was a Friday night, so of course we were hanging out. Most of the time, we didn't have a plan for anything. We would just kind of come up with things to do as the night went on. By 12, two of our friends had decided to go home because they were tired, which left just me and my friend Dan. Neither of us were that tired, but we also didn't want to sit around at home bored all night. Dan brought up the cemetery by his house and said it'd be spooky and exciting to walk around that night. With nothing better to do, I agreed. I don't remember thinking anything of it. Sure, it would be a little creepy and eerie, but I knew it was just a regular cemetery. We took Dan's car and drove to his house, where we parked and walked down the block to the gate surrounding the graveyard. There was a huge entrance gateway, but the gate that went around the perimeter was more of a short wooden fence. We climbed over with ease, and right away, we got a rush of adrenaline. It was a creepy place, no doubt. There was almost no light, only a few dim standing lamps spread across the graveyard. I'm not sure what our goal was, but I think it was just to walk across the whole place without getting scared and then leave. We passed 10 or 15 gravestones when Dan came to a stop. He was looking ahead and told me to wait. I couldn't see much, but in the distance, I could barely make out a figure standing next to one of the gravestones, walking closer to us. Both me and Dan were unsure what to do and just stood there. We both assumed we had totally been caught by one of the graveyard keepers and were probably gonna get arrested or something. The man stopped several feet away, still too far for us to get a good look at him. "What are you two doing here?" he asked. Dan nervously said that we were just exploring. "Well, I'm gonna have to show you two out," he said. He told us to follow him and began walking back in the direction he came in. I think both of us were regretting not running away when we first saw him. As we walked behind him, he passed under one of those standing lamps and both Dan and I immediately froze. The man was wearing ragged clothes, nothing like a graveyard keeper would be wearing. This guy looked like he was homeless. The man must have heard us stop. He turned around, and you could see in his face that this man was crazy. He took a step toward us. "Come here," he said angrily. Dan turned and ran, and I did the same. The man's footsteps behind me were so close it felt like he was going to tackle me at any second. My adrenaline kept me going, and we managed to jump the fence. We heard the man stop on the other side, then punch the wood fence in frustration. We immediately went home and told no one except for our friends because we knew what we were doing was illegal. Both of us think that that man was some homeless person who was probably trying to rob us or maybe do something much worse. Luckily, we never made the mistake of going back there again.